the smallest royal pyramid of the Old Kingdom, contains the biggest idea in the history of Egyptian civilization. The pyramid stands at Saqqara, the ancient necropolis above Memphis, the same plateau where Imhotep had built the step pyramid roughly 3 centuries earlier. It is not impressive, it is not large. It rises to a height of only 43 meters, less than a third of the Great Pyramid's height, smaller than any other royal pyramid of the Old Kingdom. Its limestone casing has been almost entirely stripped away by centuries of stone robbers, and what remains is a low, eroded mound of rubble that a casual visitor might mistake for a natural hill rather than a monument built for a pharaoh. The exterior tells a story of modesty, of diminished ambition, of a building tradition that was already beginning its long decline from the heights of the Fourth Dynasty. But the exterior is a lie, because inside the Pyramid of Unas, inside the burial chamber and the antechamber that were carved into the bedrock beneath the modest superstructure, there is something that no previous pyramid had ever contained, something that would prove more powerful, more enduring, and more influential than the millions of tons of stone that constituted the Great Pyramid. Something that would outlast every pyramid ever built, that would be copied and adapted for the next 2,000 years, and that would become the foundation of the most extensive body of religious literature in the ancient world. Words. The walls of the Pyramid of Unas are covered with words, hundreds of columns of hieroglyphic text carved into the limestone and filled with blue-green pigment, covering every surface of the burial chamber and the antechamber in a continuous stream of religious utterances, magical spells, and cosmic declarations that were designed to ensure the pharaoh's survival in the afterlife. The texts are the oldest substantial body of religious literature in human history. Older than the Vedas, older than the Hebrew Bible, older than any other collection of religious writing that has survived from the ancient world. The texts are known as the Pyramid Texts, and their appearance inside the Pyramid of Unas around 2350 BC marks one of the most important moments in the history of human civilization. The moment when a culture that had relied on architecture to ensure the pharaoh's eternal survival recognized that words might do the job better. The numbers are striking. The Great Pyramid of Giza contains roughly 2.3 million stone blocks, and not a single word of text on its interior walls. The Pyramid of Unas contains a modest volume of stone and 228 utterances, spells, prayers, hymns, and declarations that cover the walls of the burial chamber from floor to ceiling in columns of hieroglyphs that have survived for more than 4,300 years. The Great Pyramid bet on mass. The Pyramid of Unas bet on meaning. And meaning won because the texts that Unas inscribed on his walls have survived intact, readable, and influential, while the Great Pyramid's interior walls remain blank and silent, carrying no message except the message of stone. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand the story of the pyramid that changed the rules. The pyramid that demonstrated, for the first time in Egyptian history, that the pharaoh's survival in the afterlife could be ensured not merely by the size of his tomb or the weight of the stone above his body, but by the power of the written word inscribed on the walls around him. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it genuinely helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. The paradox of the Pyramid of Unas, the smallest royal pyramid containing the most enduring legacy, is one of the most instructive paradoxes in the history of architecture. For 3 centuries, the Egyptian pharaohs had been building ever larger pyramids in pursuit of ever greater permanence, betting on mass, betting on stone, betting on the assumption that bigger tombs would provide better protection for the pharaoh's body and better prospects for his eternal survival. The bet had produced the Step Pyramid, the Bent Pyramid, the Red Pyramid, and the Great Pyramid, the most impressive sequence of stone structures in human history. But the bet had also produced a troubling realization. The realization that physical size, however impressive, could not guarantee the specific, articulated, theologically precise religious protection that the pharaoh's soul required. A pyramid can protect a body, only words can protect a soul. The Pyramid of Unas was the first structure to act on this realization, the first to complement the architectural protection of the body with the textual protection of the soul, the first to recognize that the pharaoh's survival in the afterlife depended not merely on the physical preservation of his remains, but on the continued performance of the rituals and the continued recitation of the spells that sustained his spirit in the eternal realm. The texts on the walls of the burial chamber were the permanent version of those rituals, carved into stone so that the spells would continue to be spoken, even if the priests who were supposed to recite them had ceased to come, even if the funerary cult had been abandoned, even if the entire institutional framework that supported the pharaoh's eternal maintenance had collapsed. Now, let's begin. To understand the Pyramid of Unas, you must first understand the world in which it was built. The world of the late Fifth Dynasty, a period of transition and transformation in which the certainties of the early Old Kingdom were beginning to give way to the uncertainties that would eventually produce the collapse of the Old Kingdom state. The Fifth Dynasty, the dynasty to which Unas belonged, was different from the Fourth Dynasty that had preceded it. The Fourth Dynasty had been the dynasty of the great builders, the dynasty that produced the pyramids of Giza, the Sphinx, and the most impressive monuments of the ancient world. The Fourth Dynasty pharaohs had invested the resources of the state in pyramids of unprecedented scale, pyramids that were designed to overwhelm, to dominate the landscape, and to proclaim, through their sheer size and their geometric perfection, the absolute power of the pharaoh and his connection to the divine order. The strategy was architectural. The pharaoh's eternal survival was ensured by the physical permanence of his tomb, by the mass of the stone that surrounded his body, and by the endurance of the structure that housed his spirit. The Fifth Dynasty took a different approach. The Fifth Dynasty pyramids were smaller than the Fourth Dynasty pyramids, significantly smaller, reflecting a shift in the allocation of state resources away from the pyramid itself and toward the sun temples and the mortuary temples that surrounded it. The shift reflected a change in religious emphasis. The solar theology that had been an important element of Egyptian religion since the earliest dynasties became, during the Fifth Dynasty, the dominant theological framework, and the construction of sun temples, open-air complexes dedicated to the worship of the sun god Re, became as important as the construction of pyramids for the pharaoh's burial. The pharaoh's relationship to Re, his role as the son of the sun god, his participation in the daily cycle of solar rebirth, became the central theme of royal ideology, and the architectural expression of this theme shifted from the pyramid, a symbol of the cosmic connection between earth and sky, to the sun temple, a direct expression of the solar cult. The shift in architectural emphasis had consequences for the pyramid itself. The pyramids of the Fifth Dynasty were smaller, less precisely constructed, and less structurally ambitious than their Fourth Dynasty predecessors. The reduction in size was not merely a matter of economics. It reflected a genuine change in the understanding of how the pharaoh's eternal survival was to be ensured. The Fourth Dynasty model had relied on architectural mass, on the sheer weight and permanence of the stone structure. The Fifth Dynasty model was beginning to rely on something else, on ritual, on theology, on the power of religious practice to maintain the pharaoh's connection to the divine order. The pyramid texts that would appear in the Pyramid of Unas at the end of the Fifth Dynasty were the culmination of this shift, the moment when the reliance on ritual theology was given permanent, physical expression in the form of texts inscribed on the walls of the burial chamber. The religious transformation that produced the pyramid texts was not a sudden event. It was a gradual process that extended over the entire Fifth Dynasty, and that reflected deeper changes in the Egyptian understanding of the relationship between the pharaoh, the gods, and the cosmos. The early Old Kingdom, the Third and Fourth Dynasties, had been a period of confident architectural expression, in which the pyramid served as the primary instrument of the pharaoh's eternal survival. The pharaoh's divine status was expressed through the pyramid's form, its mass, its permanence, its cosmic geometry, and the massive architectural statement was considered entirely sufficient. No written texts were needed because the architecture itself was the message. The Fifth Dynasty introduced a new element into this equation, the element of theological articulation, the desire to express the pharaoh's religious status not merely through architectural form, but through specific, verbally articulated religious declarations that defined his relationship to the gods in precise and detailed terms. The sun temples of the Fifth Dynasty were one expression of this desire. They provided architectural settings for the performance of religious rituals that articulated the pharaoh's relationship to the sun god Re in ways that the pyramid alone could not express. The pyramid texts were another expression. They provided a permanent record of the religious declarations that defined the pharaoh's divine status and that ensured his participation in the cosmic order that the Egyptian religious system described. The development of the Egyptian scribal tradition during the Fifth Dynasty provided the technical capability that made the pyramid texts possible. The scribal schools, the institutions that trained the administrators, the priests, and the record keepers of the Egyptian state, had been developing the technology of writing for centuries, producing a class of literate professionals who were capable of composing, copying, and inscribing complex texts in the hieroglyphic script. The scribal tradition was among the most sophisticated and most productive in the entire ancient world. It had produced administrative documents, legal texts, literary compositions, and religious formulas of considerable complexity, and it had developed the conventions of layout, spacing, and orientation that would be needed for the inscription of texts on the walls of a burial chamber. The specific scribal skills that were needed for the pyramid texts were specialized. They required not merely the ability to read and write hieroglyphs, but the ability to carve them into stone, to arrange them in columns and rows that followed the conventions of the religious program, and to apply the blue-green pigment that filled the carved signs and that gave the inscriptions their distinctive appearance. The skills were held by a small number of master craftsmen, specialists who had been trained in the specific techniques of stone inscription and who brought to the Pyramid of Unas the accumulated expertise of a tradition that had been developing for generations. The theological content of the pyramid texts reflects the religious synthesis that characterized the late Fifth Dynasty, a synthesis that combined elements of the solar theology, the worship of Re as the supreme god and the pharaoh's identification as the son of Re, the stellar theology, the belief that the pharaoh's spirit would ascend to the stars and join the circumpolar constellations in their eternal circling of the celestial pole, and the Osirian theology, the identification of the dead pharaoh with Osiris, the god of the dead and the ruler of the underworld. The synthesis was complex. It combined theological traditions that were, in some respects, contradictory, and the pyramid texts preserve the complexity without resolving the contradictions. The pharaoh is simultaneously the son of Re, ascending to the sun, a star among the imperishable stars, joining the circumpolar constellations, and the embodiment of Osiris, ruling the underworld, and the pyramid texts provide spells and declarations that support all three identifications without attempting to reconcile them into a single, consistent theological framework. The theological complexity of the pyramid texts has been a source of both fascination and frustration for modern scholars. Fascination because the texts reveal the richness and the sophistication of the Egyptian religious imagination. Frustration because the apparent contradictions within the texts make it difficult to construct a coherent, systematic account of the Egyptian understanding of the afterlife. The difficulty has led to extensive scholarly debate about the relative chronology of the different theological traditions, about the relationship between the solar, the stellar, and the Osirian elements, and about the extent to which the texts represent a unified theological vision or a compilation of diverse and sometimes incompatible beliefs. Unas was the last pharaoh of the Fifth Dynasty, a ruler whose reign of approximately 15 to 30 years marked the end of the dynasty and the transition to the Sixth Dynasty that would follow. Unas is not one of the famous pharaohs of Egyptian history. His name is not well known to the general public, and his reign is not associated with the kind of dramatic events or impressive monuments that attract popular attention. But Yunus's contribution to the history of Egyptian civilization is immeasurable, because the decision to inscribe the pyramid texts on the walls of his burial chamber was one of the most consequential decisions in the history of Egyptian religion, one that would shape the development of Egyptian funerary beliefs for the next 2,000 years. The Saqqara Plateau, the site of the Pyramid of Unas, was one of the most venerated and most crowded burial sites in Egypt by the time of Unas's reign. The plateau had been used for burials since the earliest dynasties. The tombs of the First and Second Dynasty rulers, the step pyramid of Djoser, the pyramids of the later Third Dynasty and the Fifth Dynasty pharaohs were all located on the plateau, creating a landscape of the dead that stretched for kilometers along the western edge of the Nile Valley. The choice of Saqqara for Unas's pyramid was consistent with the tradition, but the location of the pyramid, near the southwestern corner of the step pyramid complex, placed it in a position that was both symbolically significant and practically convenient, connecting Unas to the tradition of Djoser while providing a site that offered the necessary space and the necessary geological conditions for pyramid construction. The construction of the Pyramid of Unas followed the standard methods of late Fifth Dynasty pyramid construction, a core of roughly cut limestone blocks, covered with a casing of fine Tura limestone, built on a foundation of leveled bedrock. The construction was competent but not exceptional. The blocks were smaller than the blocks of the Fourth Dynasty pyramids. The joints were less precise, and the overall quality of the construction was lower than the standard that Khufu's builders had achieved 2 centuries earlier. The reduction in quality reflected the same factors that had produced the reduction in size: the shift in resources toward the sun temples and the mortuary temples, the gradual attenuation of the construction knowledge that had peaked during the Fourth Dynasty, and the diminished ambition that characterized the late Fifth Dynasty building program. The construction of the Pyramid of Unas, while modest by Fourth Dynasty standards, was still a significant undertaking that required the mobilization of quarrymen, masons, transport workers, scribes, and administrators over a period of years. The pyramid was built using the standard late Fifth Dynasty methods, a core of roughly cut local limestone blocks covered with a casing of fine Tura limestone that was transported across the Nile from the quarries on the east bank. The core blocks were smaller and less precisely cut than the blocks of the Fourth Dynasty pyramids, reflecting the gradual decline in construction quality that characterized the later Old Kingdom building tradition. The casing blocks were of higher quality, cut from the fine-grained Tura limestone that had been the standard casing material since the time of Sneferu, and finished to a smooth surface that created the gleaming white exterior that the finished pyramid was designed to present. The internal structure of the Pyramid of Unas follows the standard layout of the late Old Kingdom pyramids: a descending passage entering the pyramid from the north face, leading to a horizontal corridor that connects to an antechamber and then to the burial chamber itself. The burial chamber is oriented east-west, with the sarcophagus placed against the western wall, the wall that was associated with the realm of the dead and with the setting sun. The antechamber is located to the east of the burial chamber, positioned between the burial chamber and the entrance passage, serving as a transitional space between the outer world and the innermost sanctum of the tomb. The sarcophagus of Unas, a large rectangular chest of dark stone, possibly basalt or greywacke, was placed against the western wall of the burial chamber, directly beneath the texts that address the protection and the sustenance of the pharaoh's body. The sarcophagus was found empty. The pharaoh's mummy had been removed, probably by ancient tomb robbers, who entered the pyramid through the entrance passage and who stripped the burial of its valuable contents. The robbers took the treasure, but they left the texts. The irony is precise. The things of material value were stolen, but the things of spiritual value, the words, the spells, the declarations that were designed to protect the pharaoh's soul, were left untouched, carved into the stone, inaccessible to theft and impervious to the passage of time. The workforce that carved and inscribed the pyramid texts was a specialized team of craftsmen whose skills were different from the skills of the quarrymen and the masons who built the pyramid's superstructure. The text carvers were scribes, literate professionals who had been trained in the hieroglyphic script and who possessed the technical skill to translate the written text into carved stone. The carving required precision. Each hieroglyph had to be cut to the correct shape and the correct depth, with clean edges and consistent proportions, creating a visual effect that was both aesthetically pleasing and functionally legible. The blue-green pigment that filled the carved signs was applied after the carving was complete. The pigment was a mixture of finely ground copper-based minerals suspended in a binding medium, applied with a brush or a reed pen, and allowed to dry in the enclosed environment of the burial chamber. The time required for the carving and the painting of the pyramid texts was significant. The 228 utterances cover the walls of the burial chamber and the antechamber in dense columns of hieroglyphs that represent months of sustained, meticulous labor. The work was done in the confined space of the burial chamber, a space that was illuminated by torches or oil lamps, that was ventilated by the entrance passage, and that required the craftsmen to work in positions that were physically demanding and that limited their productivity. The time and the labor that the inscription of the texts required were substantial additions to the overall construction effort, additions that would not have been necessary if the walls had been left blank as the walls of the earlier pyramids had been. The role of the Heliopolitan priesthood in the development of the pyramid texts deserves particular attention because Heliopolis, the ancient center of the solar cult, located near modern Cairo, was the primary intellectual center from which the theological concepts of the pyramid texts were drawn. The priests of Heliopolis were the custodians of the solar theology, the belief system that identified the pharaoh as the son of the sun god Re, and that described the pharaoh's afterlife as a journey to the sky to join Re in the eternal solar cycle. The solar theology was the dominant theological framework of the Fifth Dynasty, the framework within which the pyramid texts were composed, and the framework that provides the interpretive context for understanding the individual utterances. The Heliopolitan influence on the pyramid texts is visible in the frequent references to Re and to the solar mythology that surrounded him. The daily journey of the sun across the sky, the nightly journey through the underworld, the eternal cycle of death and rebirth that the sun's daily passage represented, and the pharaoh's participation in this cycle as the sun and the companion of the sun god. The solar references are among the most prominent features of the pyramid texts. They establish the cosmic context within which the pharaoh's afterlife unfolds, and they define the ultimate destination of the pharaoh's spiritual journey as the celestial realm of the sun. The Memphite theology, the theological tradition associated with the city of Memphis and with the god Ptah, also contributed to the pyramid texts, though its influence is less prominent than the Heliopolitan influence. The Memphite theology emphasized the creative power of the spoken word. The belief that the god Pa had created the world through the power of thought and speech, conceiving the elements of creation in his mind, and then bringing them into existence by speaking their names. The emphasis on the creative power of speech is directly relevant to the pyramid texts, because the texts themselves are instruments of creative speech, declarations that create reality through the power of the words they contain. The role of the offering cult in the ongoing maintenance of the pharaoh's spiritual welfare provides essential context for understanding why the pyramid texts were inscribed on the walls of the burial chamber. The offering cult was a permanent institution, a priestly establishment that was funded by endowed estates, and that was responsible for the daily presentation of food, drink, and other offerings to the spirit of the deceased pharaoh. The cult was intended to operate indefinitely, but the Egyptian experience had shown that cults could be disrupted, that endowments could be diverted, and that the institutional structures that supported the ongoing maintenance of the pharaoh's welfare were vulnerable to the political and economic changes that affected all Egyptian institutions over time. The pyramid texts were in part a response to this vulnerability, a backup system that would ensure the pharaoh's spiritual protection even if the offering cult ceased to function, a permanent inscription of the spells and the declarations that would normally have been recited by the priests, but that could continue to operate through the magical power of the inscribed word, even in the absence of a human performer. The mortuary temple of the Pyramid of Unas, located on the eastern face of the pyramid, was a more elaborate structure than the modest pyramid might suggest. The temple included an offering hall, storage rooms, a courtyard, and a series of subsidiary chambers that served specific ritual functions within the funerary program. The temple was built of stone, fine limestone that was cut and fitted with a precision that demonstrated the builder's continuing capability in small-scale stone construction, even as their capability for large-scale pyramid construction was declining. The mortuary temple was the ritual center of the funerary complex, the place where the daily offerings were presented, the prayers were recited, and the ceremonies that sustained the pharaoh's spirit in the afterlife were performed. The valley temple of the Pyramid of Unas, located at the edge of the cultivation, where the agricultural floodplain meets the desert plateau, has been partially excavated and provides evidence for the rituals that accompanied the pharaoh's funeral and for the ongoing maintenance of the funerary cult. The valley temple was the first structure that the funeral procession would have encountered, the starting point of the journey from the world of the living to the world of the dead that the causeway and the pyramid complex were designed to facilitate. The valley temple has yielded some architectural fragments and the remains of a quay, a stone platform at which the boats carrying the funeral procession would have docked after crossing the Nile from the east bank. The relationship between the architectural modesty of the Pyramid of Unas and the theological ambition of the pyramid texts raises a question about the priorities of the late Fifth Dynasty building program, the question of whether the reduction in pyramid size was accompanied by an increase in the importance attached to the texts and the rituals that the pyramid was designed to house. The question is important because it suggests a fundamental shift in the understanding of what a pyramid was for, a shift from the pyramid as a massive architectural statement of royal power to the pyramid as a container for the texts and the rituals that actually ensured the pharaoh's survival. The shift was not complete. The pyramid was still a pyramid, still a monumental structure, still a visual statement of royal authority. But the balance had changed. The text had become more important than the mass. The words had become more important than the stone, and the content had become more important than the container. The economic dimensions of the pyramid text's inscription deserve attention, because the carving and the painting of the texts represented a significant addition to the overall cost of the pyramid's construction, an addition that was not required by the architectural program alone, and that reflected the decision to invest resources in the textual program that might otherwise have been invested in the architectural program. The investment in the texts was a deliberate choice, a choice that prioritized the verbal protection of the pharaoh's soul over the physical protection of his body, the power of the word over the power of the stone, and the permanence of the inscription over the permanence of the mass. The political context of Unas's reign, the last reign of the Fifth Dynasty, adds an additional dimension to the story of the pyramid texts. Unas came to power at a time when the Fifth Dynasty was showing signs of strain. The provincial governors were becoming more powerful, the central authority of the pharaoh was being challenged by competing centers of influence, and the economic resources available for royal construction projects were being eroded by the growing claims of the temple establishments and the provincial administrations. The pyramid texts may have been, in part, a response to these political pressures, an assertion of the pharaoh's divine status and his cosmic authority at a time when his earthly authority was being challenged, a declaration in stone and pigment that the pharaoh's essential relationship to the gods was fundamentally undiminished even as his relationship to his earthly subjects was under strain. The transition from the Fifth Dynasty to the Sixth Dynasty, the political change that occurred at the end of Unas's reign, was peaceful in its outward appearance but may have involved more complex dynamics than the historical record reveals. The first pharaoh of the Sixth Dynasty, Teti, married a daughter of Unas, creating a dynastic connection that legitimized the new dynasty's claim to the throne and that ensured continuity between the two reigns. The marriage was a political arrangement, a mechanism for transferring power from one dynasty to another, without the disruption and the instability that could accompany an unlegitimized succession. The arrangement may explain why Teti adopted the practice of inscribing pyramid texts in his own pyramid. The continuation of the textual tradition that Yunus had established may have been part of the legitimization strategy, a demonstration that the new pharaoh was the legitimate successor of the old, and that the religious innovations of the previous dynasty would be preserved and continued under the new. The significance of the pyramid texts for the study of the Egyptian language deserves emphasis, because the texts preserve linguistic forms that are among the oldest documented examples of the Egyptian language and that provide invaluable evidence for the study of the language's history and its development. The language of the pyramid texts includes archaic vocabulary, archaic grammatical constructions, and archaic spelling conventions that are not found in contemporary administrative or literary texts, forms that represent an earlier stage of the language's development, and that were preserved in the religious tradition even as the spoken language evolved and changed. The preservation of these archaic forms is one of the most important features of the pyramid texts for modern linguistics. It provides a window into a stage of the Egyptian language that is otherwise almost entirely undocumented, and that is essential for understanding the historical development of one of the longest-lived languages in human history. The causeway of the Pyramid of Unas, the covered corridor that connected the mortuary temple on the eastern face of the pyramid to the valley temple at the edge of the cultivation, is one of the most important features of the Unas complex because its walls were decorated with relief sculptures that provide some of the most detailed and most revealing images of life in the late Old Kingdom. The causeway reliefs include scenes that are unique in Egyptian royal art, scenes of famine, of emaciated people, of starving bodies that are almost skeletal in their thinness. The famine scenes are extraordinary. They represent a departure from the idealized imagery that characterized most Egyptian royal art, an acknowledgement of suffering and deprivation that is rare in the context of royal monuments, and that has been interpreted by scholars as evidence of the environmental and economic stresses that were beginning to affect the Egyptian state during the late Fifth Dynasty. The famine scenes have been the subject of intense scholarly debate. Some scholars interpret them as evidence of an actual famine that occurred during Yunas's reign, while others interpret them as symbolic representations of foreign peoples, or as ritual images that served a specific religious function within the context of the causeway's decorative program. The debate is unresolved, but the presence of the scenes, whatever their specific meaning, demonstrates that the late Fifth Dynasty was a period of awareness, of acknowledgement, and possibly of crisis that was reflected in the art and the architecture of the period. The core problem of the Pyramid of Unas is not structural. The pyramid, though small and now badly eroded, was a competent piece of construction that served its intended purpose without the kind of dramatic structural failure that characterized the Midan pyramid or the bent pyramid. The core problem is conceptual. It concerns the nature of the innovation that the pyramid texts represent, the reasons why the texts appeared when they did, and the implications of the decision to inscribe religious texts on the walls of the burial chamber for the entire subsequent history of Egyptian civilization. The question of why the pyramid texts appeared in the Pyramid of Unas. Why Unas was the first pharaoh to inscribe texts on the walls of his burial chamber when none of his predecessors had done so, is one of the most debated questions in the study of ancient Egyptian religion. The question is important because the pyramid texts did not appear from nowhere. They were composed from existing religious traditions, from oral recitations and ritual performance that had been part of the Egyptian funerary tradition for centuries before they were committed to stone. The texts were not new. Many of the individual utterances that make up the pyramid texts are believed to be much older than the pyramid in which they were first inscribed, originating in the earliest periods of Egyptian religious thought and transmitted orally through generations of priests. before being written down in the Pyramid of Unas. The decision to write them down, to inscribe the texts on the walls of the burial chamber in permanent hieroglyphic form, was the innovation. The decision transformed the texts from oral performance to physical inscription, from ephemeral ritual to permanent record, from words that existed only in the minds and the voices of the priests, to words that were carved into stone and that would endure for as long as the stone itself survived. The transformation was profound. It changed the relationship between the pharaoh and his religious texts, between the ritual and the record, between the spoken word and the written word, in ways that would shape the development of Egyptian religion for the next 2 millennia. Something is wrong with our assumptions when we treat the pyramid texts as merely a collection of prayers or spells, as if they were the ancient equivalent of a prayer book, a compilation of religious formulas that were inscribed on the walls for the pharaoh to read in the afterlife. The pyramid texts were not a prayer book. They were a technology for ensuring the pharaoh's survival in the afterlife. A technology that was as deliberately designed and as carefully engineered as the pyramid itself. The texts were not passive, they were active, designed to produce specific effects in the spiritual realm, to transform the pharaoh from a dead body into a living god, to propel his spirit from the burial chamber to the stars, and to ensure his eternal participation in the cosmic cycle of creation and renewal. The technology of the texts was different from the technology of the architecture, but it served the same purpose. The architecture protected the body, the texts protected the soul. The architecture provided a physical environment for the pharaoh's eternal existence. The text provided a spiritual environment, a framework of words, of spells, of declarations that surrounded the pharaoh's spirit with the power of divine language and that ensured his transformation from mortal to immortal. The two technologies, the architectural and the textual, were complementary, each one addressing a different aspect of the pharaoh's survival, and each one contributing to the comprehensive system of protection that the Egyptian funerary tradition was designed to provide. The question of whether the pyramid texts were composed specifically for the Pyramid of Unas, or whether they were drawn from a pre-existing corpus of religious literature, is one that has been addressed by scholars through the analysis of the language, the content, and the textual variants of the individual utterances. The analysis has revealed that the texts are not homogeneous. They include utterances that were composed at different times, in different places, and for different purposes, and that were brought together in the Pyramid of Unas to create a comprehensive collection that addressed all aspects of the pharaoh's afterlife journey. The oldest utterances in the collection are believed to date to the very beginning of the dynastic period, or even earlier, to the pre-dynastic era before the unification of Egypt. These utterances preserve religious beliefs and ritual practices that are archaic in their language and in their content, beliefs about the power of specific gods, about the dangers of the afterlife journey, and about the magical properties of specific substances and specific actions that can protect the deceased from harm. The archaic utterances are among the most difficult texts in the pyramid texts corpus. Their language is obscure, their references are opaque, and their meaning is often uncertain, reflecting the great antiquity of the traditions they preserve. The more recent utterances in the collection, the utterances that were composed during the Fifth Dynasty or the immediately preceding period, are more accessible in their language and more transparent in their meaning. These utterances reflect the theological developments of the later Old Kingdom, the solar theology, the stellar theology, and the emerging Osirian theology that would become the dominant framework for Egyptian funerary religion in subsequent periods. The more recent utterances are also more specific in their references. They mention specific gods, specific ritual actions, and specific cosmic locations that can be identified and understood within the context of the late Old Kingdom religious system. The combination of old and new utterances within a single collection is one of the most characteristic features of the pyramid texts, and one of the most revealing. The combination demonstrates that the Egyptian religious tradition was both conservative and innovative, conservative in its preservation of ancient beliefs and practices that were centuries or even millennia old, and innovative in its willingness to add new beliefs and new practices to the existing corpus without discarding or replacing the older material. The conservatism and the innovation coexisted, producing a body of religious literature that was simultaneously ancient and contemporary, traditional and progressive, rooted in the deepest past and responsive to the developments of the present. The spatial arrangement of the texts within the burial chamber and the antechamber of the Pyramid of Unas has been studied in detail by scholars who have attempted to identify the principles that govern the selection and the placement of individual utterances. The analysis has revealed a coherent program, a deliberate arrangement in which the texts are organized according to a sequence that mirrors the pharaoh's journey from death to eternal life. The journey begins at the sarcophagus, where the texts on the west wall address the protection and the sustenance of the pharaoh's body in the immediate aftermath of death. The journey continues to the east, where the texts on the east wall address the resurrection and the ascent of the pharaoh's spirit from the burial chamber to the sky. The journey extends through the antechamber, where additional texts address the pharaoh's passage through the dangers of the underworld and his arrival at the celestial realm. And the journey concludes at the entrance to the pyramid, where the final texts address the pharaoh's integration into the cosmic order and his eternal participation in the cycle of solar rebirth. The sequential arrangement transforms the burial chamber from a static space into a dynamic narrative, a story that unfolds as the reader, or the spirit, moves from wall to wall, from chamber to chamber, from the sarcophagus at the center of the burial to the entrance of the pyramid at its outer edge. The narrative is the pharaoh's journey, and the texts are the guidebook, the manual, the set of instructions that the pharaoh's spirit needs to follow in order to navigate the dangers of the afterlife and to achieve the transformation from mortal to immortal. That is the ultimate goal of the Egyptian funerary tradition, and it gets stranger, because the arrangement of the texts within the burial chamber was not random. It was carefully planned, with specific texts assigned to specific walls and specific locations within the chamber according to a program that reflected the theological understanding of the space and its function. The texts on the west wall, the wall behind the sarcophagus, were concerned with the pharaoh's protection and his sustenance in the afterlife, providing the spells that would ensure his safety and his nourishment in the eternal realm. The texts on the east wall, the wall facing the entrance to the chamber, were concerned with the pharaoh's resurrection and his ascent to the sky, providing the spells that would propel his spirit upward from the burial chamber to the stars. The texts on the north and south walls addressed other aspects of the pharaoh's afterlife journey, his identification with the gods, his triumph over the forces of chaos, his participation in the eternal cycle of solar rebirth. The relationship between the pyramid texts and the oral tradition from which they were drawn is one of the most important and most difficult questions in the study of ancient Egyptian religion. The texts were not composed de novo for the Pyramid of Unas. They were selected from a pre-existing body of religious literature that had been transmitted orally for generations or centuries before being committed to stone. The oral tradition was the original form of the religious literature, the form in which the spells and the declarations had been created, performed, and transmitted before the technology of writing was applied to the task of preserving them in permanent form. The transition from oral to written form was a transformation of the highest significance, because it changed the nature of the texts and their relationship to the ritual context in which they had originally been performed. In their oral form, the texts were performances. They were spoken, chanted, or sung by priests in the context of specific rituals, and their power derived from the act of performance, from the voice of the priest, from the ritual context in which the words were spoken. In their written form, the texts were inscriptions. They were carved into stone, fixed in place, and available for reading, or for magical activation, without the intervention of a human performer. The transition from oral to written was a transition from performance to permanence, from the ephemeral power of the spoken word to the enduring power of the written word, from the dependence on a human performer to the independence of a carved inscription. The independence of the written text from the human performer was one of the most important consequences of the transition, because it freed the religious literature from its dependence on the institutional framework that supported the oral tradition. The oral tradition required priests, trained, authorized, institutionally supported performers who could recite the text correctly and who could perform the rituals in which the texts were embedded. The written texts required no priests. They were self-executing, their power activated by their mere existence on the walls of the burial chamber, their spells operative without the need for a human voice to speak them. The self-executing character of the written texts was a revolutionary innovation. It meant that the pharaoh's spiritual protection would continue, even if the priestly establishment collapsed, even if the funerary cult was abandoned, even if the entire institutional framework of the Egyptian state ceased to function. The words would endure, the words would work, the words would protect. The question of why no earlier pharaoh of the Fourth Dynasty, no builder of the Great Pyramids of Giza, had inscribed texts on the walls of his burial chamber is one that illuminates the specific historical conditions that produce the pyramid texts and that distinguishes the Fifth Dynasty innovation from the Fourth Dynasty tradition. The most common explanation is that the Fourth Dynasty pharaohs relied on architectural mass rather than textual magic for the protection of their souls. That the sheer size and the structural soundness of the Great Pyramid and its companions were considered sufficient, and that the addition of texts was not needed because the architecture itself provided all the protection that the pharaoh required. The explanation is plausible, but it may not be complete. The Fourth Dynasty pharaohs may also have been constrained by religious conventions that prohibited or discouraged the inscription of sacred texts on the walls of the burial chamber, conventions that regarded the texts as too sacred, too powerful, or too dangerous to be committed to permanent written form. The oral tradition may have been considered the appropriate medium for the sacred texts. The spoken word, recited by a living priest in the context of a living ritual, may have been regarded as the only proper way to activate the magical power of the spells, and the inscription of the texts on stone may have been seen as a diminishment rather than an enhancement of their power. The Fifth Dynasty innovation, the decision to inscribe the texts, despite whatever conventions had previously prevented it, may have been driven by a loss of confidence in the institutional structures that supported the oral tradition. The late Fifth Dynasty was a period of political and economic stress, a period in which the pharaoh's authority was being challenged, in which the resources available for the maintenance of the funerary cults were being reduced, and in which the reliability of the institutional structures that supported the ongoing performance of the funerary rituals was increasingly uncertain. The inscription of the texts may have been a response to this uncertainty, a decision to commit the sacred literature to stone, precisely because the institutions that maintained the oral tradition could no longer be trusted to function indefinitely. The interpretation connects the pyramid texts to the broader political and institutional history of the late Old Kingdom. It suggests that the decision to inscribe the texts was not merely a theological innovation, but a practical response to political conditions that threatened the reliability of the institutional structures on which the pharaoh's eternal survival depended. The interpretation is speculative. The evidence does not confirm it conclusively, but it is consistent with the broader pattern of late Old Kingdom history, in which the gradual weakening of the central authority and the gradual empowerment of the provincial governors created conditions of increasing institutional uncertainty that affected every aspect of the Egyptian state's operations. The question of whether the pyramid texts were intended to be read, whether the inscriptions were designed to be seen and comprehended by a human reader, or whether they were designed to operate autonomously, generating their magical effects without the need for a human audience, is a question that illuminates the Egyptian understanding of the relationship between reading and magical activation. The most likely answer is that the texts were designed to operate on both levels. They could be read and recited by a human reader, the priest who performed the funerary rituals, and they could also operate autonomously, generating their magical effects through the mere fact of their existence on the walls of the burial chamber. The dual function was the innovation. The texts served both as a performance script for the living priests and as a self-activating, magical system that would continue to function after the priests had departed. The concept of the self-activating text, a text that produces its effects without the intervention of a human reader, is one of the most fascinating and most alien concepts in the Egyptian religious system. The concept assumes that the written word has an inherent power that is independent of the reader, a power that derives from the magical properties of the hieroglyphic signs themselves, from the cosmic connections that the signs embody, and from the hika that the inscription activates through the mere fact of its physical existence. The concept is alien to the modern understanding of writing, which treats the written word as a passive record that requires a reader to activate its meaning. But it was fundamental to the Egyptian understanding, and it was the principle that made the pyramid texts possible and that gave the inscriptions their power. The question of who composed the pyramid texts, who was responsible for the creation of the individual utterances that make up the collection, is a question that the evidence does not answer directly, but that the circumstantial evidence addresses in suggestive ways. The most likely composers were the priests of the major religious centers, the priests of Heliopolis, the center of the solar cult, the priests of Memphis, the center of the cult of Ptah, and the priests of Abydos, the center of the Osirian cult, who possessed the theological knowledge and the literary skill needed to compose the spells, the prayers, and the declarations that the collection contains. The priests were the intellectual elite of the Egyptian state, the custodians of the religious knowledge that the texts preserve and the practitioners of the rituals that the texts describe. The composition of the text was not a single event. It was a process that extended over centuries, with individual utterances being composed at different times by different authors in different religious centers, and then being brought together in the final compilation that was inscribed in the Pyramid of Unas. The process of compilation was itself a creative act. The compiler, or compilers, who selected the utterances, arranged them in a specific spatial sequence, and adapted them for inscription on the walls of the burial chamber, was engaged in a task that required theological knowledge, literary judgment, and spatial awareness in equal measure. The compilation was not mechanical, it was intellectual, requiring the ability to assess the relative importance of individual texts, to identify the connections between them, and to arrange them in a sequence that would produce a coherent and effective program of spiritual protection for the pharaoh. The question of whether the pyramid texts were performed orally during the funeral ceremony, whether the priests recited the texts from the walls of the burial chamber as part of the funerary ritual, reading the inscribed spells as a guide for their performance, is a question that connects the textual analysis to the ritual analysis of the pharaoh's funeral. The evidence suggests that the texts were indeed performed, that the funeral ceremony included the oral recitation of at least some of the utterances that were inscribed on the walls, creating a ritual event in which the spoken word and the written word worked together to produce the magical effects that the texts were designed to achieve. The oral performance would have been the activating event, the moment at which the magical power of the texts was first released, the moment at which the hika that the inscriptions embodied was first directed toward its intended purpose, the moment at which the transformation of the dead pharaoh into a living god was first set in motion. The continued activation of the texts after the funeral ceremony, the ongoing generation of magical power by the inscribed words in the sealed burial chamber without the intervention of a human performer, was the innovation that distinguished the pyramid texts from the oral tradition that preceded them. The oral tradition required continuous performance. The spells had to be spoken, the rituals had to be enacted, the priests had to come to the tomb and recite the words for the words to have their effect. The inscribed texts required no performance. They operated autonomously, generating their magical power through the mere fact of their existence on the walls, independent of any human action. The autonomy was the innovation, and the autonomy was what made the texts more durable and more reliable than the oral tradition, because the text did not depend on the continued functioning of the institutions that supported the oral performance. The relationship between the pyramid texts and the physical body of the pharaoh, the mummified remains that were placed in the sarcophagus in the burial chamber, is an aspect of the text's function that connects the literary analysis to the physical reality of the funerary practice. The texts were designed to work in conjunction with the mummy, the preserved body that served as the physical anchor for the pharaoh's spiritual existence. The mummy was the target of many of the spells, the resurrection spells that commanded the pharaoh to rise, the offering spells that provided nourishment for the body, and the protection spells that warded off the forces of decay and decomposition that threatened the physical integrity of the remains. The mummification process, the elaborate procedure of preservation that was designed to maintain the body's physical form for eternity, was the physical counterpart of the textual program that the pyramid texts provided. The mummification preserved the body, the texts preserved the soul. The two processes worked together, each addressing a different dimension of the pharaoh's survival, and each contributing to the comprehensive system of protection that the Egyptian funerary tradition was designed to provide. The mummification ensured that the body would endure. The texts ensured that the spirit would be sustained, protected, and guided on its journey from death to eternal life. The relationship between the texts and the body also explains the spatial arrangement of the texts within the burial chamber, the placement of specific utterances on specific walls in relation to the position of the sarcophagus. The protection spells were placed on the wall behind the sarcophagus, the western wall, the wall that was closest to the pharaoh's head, and that provided the most immediate protection for the most vulnerable part of the body. The resurrection spells were placed on the wall facing the entrance, the eastern wall, the wall that faced the direction from which the living would approach, and the direction in which the risen pharaoh would depart. The placement was not arbitrary, it was calculated, reflecting the theological understanding of the spatial relationships between the body, the spirit, and the cosmic directions that governed the pharaoh's afterlife journey. The concept of the self-activating text had profound implications for the durability of the religious protection that the text provided, because it meant that the protection would continue for as long as the inscriptions survived, regardless of the condition of the institutions that had created them. The priests might cease to come, the offerings might cease to be delivered, the entire apparatus of the funerary cult might collapse, but the texts would continue to operate, generating their magical effects in the sealed darkness of the burial chamber, sustaining the pharaoh's spirit through the autonomous power of the inscribed word, maintaining the connection between the dead king and the cosmic order that the spells described. The question of whether the pharaoh himself participated in the selection of the texts, whether Unas had a personal role in choosing the specific utterances that would be inscribed on the walls of his burial chamber, is a question that connects the textual analysis to the personal dimension of the pharaoh's religious life. The pharaoh was the ultimate patron of the textual program, the person for whom the texts were selected, arranged, and inscribed, and the person whose eternal survival depended on the effectiveness of the textual protection. The pharaoh's personal involvement in the selection process is plausible. He may have consulted with the priests, expressed preferences for specific texts, or participated in the theological discussions that determined the content and the arrangement of the collection. The personal involvement would add a dimension of individual agency to the textual program, a dimension in which the pharaoh was not merely the passive recipient of the priest's expertise, but an active participant in the design of his own spiritual protection. The question of who selected the specific utterances that were inscribed in the Pyramid of Unas, who decided which spells to include and which to exclude from the collection that would accompany the pharaoh into eternity, is a question that connects the textual analysis to the institutional analysis of the late Fifth Dynasty priesthood. The selection was not random. It was deliberate, reflecting a theological program that addressed specific aspects of the pharaoh's afterlife journey, and that arranged the selected texts in a spatial sequence that mirrored the stages of the journey. The selection was probably made by a senior member of the priesthood, a high-ranking religious official who possessed the theological knowledge needed to identify the most appropriate texts and the spatial knowledge needed to arrange them within the burial chamber according to the program that the pharaoh's afterlife journey required. The concept of Heka, the Egyptian word for magical power, is central to understanding the pyramid texts and the role they were designed to play in the pharaoh's afterlife. Heka was not merely a supernatural force, it was a cosmic principle, a fundamental property of the universe that could be activated and directed through the power of words, rituals, and specific knowledge. The pyramid texts were instruments of Heka, devices for activating and directing the magical power that the Egyptian religious system believed pervaded the cosmos, and that could be used to achieve specific effects in the spiritual realm. The activation of Heka through words was one of the most important principles of Egyptian religious practice. The principle that the spoken or written word had the power to create reality, to transform the nature of things, and to compel the gods and the cosmic forces to act in accordance with the speaker's will. The principle was not metaphorical. The Egyptians believed that words had literal power, that a correctly spoken spell could produce real effects in the real world, and that the inscription of a spell on the wall of a tomb could produce the same effects as the spoken performance of the spell by a priest. The pyramid texts were the permanent activation of this power, the carved inscription of the spells that would continuously generate Heka within the burial chamber, creating a field of magical protection that would surround the pharaoh's body and sustain his spirit for eternity. The concept of Heka also explains the specific character of the pyramid texts, their imperative tone, their declarative structure, and their insistence on the pharaoh's identity with the gods. The texts are not prayers, they are not humble requests addressed to a superior power. The texts are commands, declarations of fact that create the reality they describe through the magical power of the words themselves. When the texts declare that the pharaoh is Osiris, the declaration is not a metaphor or a wish. It is a performative utterance, a statement that creates the reality it describes by the mere act of being stated. The pharaoh is Osiris because the text says he is, and the text has the power to make it so because the text is an instrument of Heka, activated by the carving and the pigmentation of the hieroglyphs on the walls of the burial chamber. The understanding of the pyramid texts as instruments of Heka transforms the burial chamber from a passive container into an active machine, a device for the continuous generation of magical power that protects the pharaoh, transforms him from mortal to immortal, and sustains his existence in the eternal realm. The machine does not require a human operator. It operates autonomously, powered by the magical potency of the inscribed words, and activated by the physical presence of the pharaoh's body within the chamber. The machine is permanent. It operates for as long as the inscriptions survive, which is to say for as long as the stone endures. The machine is the Pyramid of Unas' most important innovation, more important than the texts themselves, more important than the specific utterances and the specific spells that the texts contain, because the machine is the concept that makes the texts work, the principle that gives the inscriptions their power, and the technology that transforms a collection of words into a functioning system for the production of immortality. The spatial arrangement of the texts transformed the burial chamber from a simple container for the pharaoh's body into a complex ritual space, a space in which the texts, the architecture, and the body of the pharaoh worked together to create the conditions for the transformation from death to eternal life. The chamber was not merely a room, it was a machine, a device for producing immortality in which the physical structure of the pyramid, the magical power of the texts, and the preserved body of the pharaoh were combined to achieve the ultimate goal of the Egyptian funerary tradition. But here's what makes this truly terrifying and truly magnificent. The texts worked, not in the literal sense that the pharaoh was actually transformed into a god and propelled to the stars, but in the sense that the texts survived. The pyramid that housed them has crumbled. The body that they were designed to protect has been lost. The rituals that they were designed to sustain have ceased, but the texts themselves, the words, the spells, the utterances that were carved into the limestone walls of the burial chamber more than 4,300 years ago, are still there, still legible, still readable, still capable of conveying the religious beliefs and the spiritual aspirations of a civilization that has been dead for millennia. The texts have outlasted the pyramid. The words have outlasted the stone. The meaning has outlasted the mass. The Pyramid of Unas' story is enriched by the exploration of its specific features, the discovery of the texts, the content of the texts, the physical characteristics of the pyramid and its complex, and the legacy that the texts have left on the subsequent history of Egyptian religion. The first exploration examines the discovery of the pyramid texts, the moment in which the modern world first encountered the oldest religious literature in human history. The discovery was made by Gaston Maspero, a French Egyptologist who would become one of the most important figures in the history of Egyptian archaeology. In 1881, Maspero entered the Pyramid of Unas and descended into the burial chamber. And there, on the walls of the chamber, he found the texts, columns of hieroglyphs, carved into the limestone, filled with blue-green pigment, covering every surface of the chamber and the antechamber in a continuous stream of religious utterances that no modern scholar had ever seen before. The discovery was electrifying. It revealed that the pyramids of the late Old Kingdom contained not merely the bodies of the pharaohs, but the words of their religion, the spells and the prayers and the declarations that constituted the oldest written expression of Egyptian religious belief. Maspero's discovery was not the result of a systematic excavation. It was the result of a combination of scholarly intuition and local knowledge. Local inhabitants of the Saqqara area had reported finding hieroglyphic inscriptions inside some of the smaller pyramids, reports that had been dismissed by some scholars who believed that the pyramid's interior walls were blank, as the interior walls of the Great Pyramid and the other Fourth Dynasty pyramids were known to be. Maspero took the reports seriously. He organized an expedition to investigate the smaller pyramids of the Fifth and Sixth Dynasties, and the investigation revealed that the burial chambers of these later pyramids were indeed inscribed with texts that the earlier, larger pyramids had not contained. The discovery transformed the study of ancient Egyptian religion. It provided scholars with a body of primary source material that was older and more extensive than anything that had previously been available, and it opened a new field of study that would occupy Egyptologists for more than a century. The pyramid texts became the foundation of the modern understanding of Egyptian religious thought, the starting point for the analysis of Egyptian beliefs about death, the afterlife, the gods, and the cosmic order that had shaped every aspect of Egyptian civilization. The second exploration examines the content of the pyramid texts, the specific utterances, spells, and declarations that were inscribed on the walls of the Pyramid of Unas, and that constitute the oldest substantial body of religious literature in the world. The pyramid texts consist of 228 utterances, individual spells or declarations that range in length from a few lines to several paragraphs, and that address a wide variety of topics related to the pharaoh's afterlife. The utterances are not organized into a single coherent narrative. They are a collection of individual texts that were selected and arranged according to a program that reflected the specific needs and the specific beliefs of the pharaoh for whom they were inscribed. The collection includes utterances of several different types. Protection spells that were designed to ward off dangers in the afterlife, resurrection spells that were designed to revive the pharaoh's body and restore his consciousness, ascension spells that were designed to propel the pharaoh's spirit to the sky, offering spells that were designed to ensure the pharaoh's sustenance in the eternal realm, and identification spells that were designed to identify the pharaoh with specific gods and to claim for him the powers and the attributes of those gods. The language of the pyramid texts is archaic, older than the language of the inscriptions on the pyramid's exterior, older than the language of the contemporary administrative texts, and in some cases so old that the scribes who inscribed the texts on the walls of the Pyramid of Unas may not have fully understood the meaning of every word they were copying. The archaic language is evidence that the texts were not composed for the Pyramid of Unas. They were inherited from a much older oral tradition, a tradition that may extend back to the very beginning of the dynastic period and perhaps even earlier. The texts preserve, in written form, the religious beliefs and the ritual practices of a period that is otherwise almost entirely undocumented, a period for which the pyramid texts are the primary, and in many cases the only source of information. The third exploration examines the physical characteristics of the inscriptions, the way the texts were carved, the pigments that were used, and the visual impact that the inscribed walls would have created in the burial chamber. The texts were carved into the limestone walls of the burial chamber, using the standard hieroglyphic script, the formal writing system of the Egyptian elite, in which each sign represents a sound, a word, or a concept, and in which the signs are arranged in columns that read from right to left or from left to right, depending on the orientation of the signs. The carving was precise. The hieroglyphs were cut with sharp edges, clean lines, demonstrating the skill of the scribes and the craftsmen who executed the work. The carved signs were filled with blue-green pigment, a mixture of copper-based minerals that produced a vivid colour that stood out against the pale limestone background, and that would have created a striking visual effect in the torchlight that illuminated the chamber during the funerary ceremonies. The ceiling of the burial chamber was decorated differently from the walls. It was painted with yellow stars on a dark blue background, creating the appearance of the night sky above the pharaoh's body. The star ceiling decoration was a common feature of Egyptian burial chambers. It represented the celestial realm to which the pharaoh's spirit would ascend, the cosmic environment in which the pharaoh would spend eternity among the imperishable stars. The combination of the star ceiling and the text-covered walls created a total environment, a space in which the visual imagery of the cosmic realm and the verbal power of the religious texts combined to produce a comprehensive system of protection and transformation that addressed every aspect of the pharaoh's journey from death to eternal life. The fourth exploration examines the legacy of the pyramid texts, the way that the texts were copied, adapted, and extended by subsequent generations, and the chain of textual transmission that connects the pyramid texts to the later religious literature of ancient Egypt. The pyramid texts were not unique to the Pyramid of Unas. They were copied and inscribed in the pyramids of the subsequent Sixth Dynasty pharaohs, including Teti, Pepi I, Merenre, and Pepi II. Each subsequent pyramid contained its own selection of texts, drawn from the same corpus of utterances that the Pyramid of Unas had used, but arranged differently and supplemented with new utterances that had not appeared in the earlier collections. The corpus grew over time. Each successive pyramid added new text to the collection, expanding the body of religious literature and extending the range of topics that the texts addressed. The chain of transmission did not end with the Old Kingdom. During the Middle Kingdom, the pyramid texts were adapted for non-royal use, inscribed on the coffins of nobles and officials rather than on the walls of pyramids, and supplemented with new spells and new declaration that addressed the specific needs and the specific beliefs of the non-royal deceased. The adapted texts are known as the coffin texts, and they represent the next stage in the evolution of the Egyptian funerary literary tradition, the stage in which the exclusive royal texts of the Old Kingdom were democratized and made available to a wider segment of the Egyptian population. The chain of transmission continued into the New Kingdom, where the funerary texts were further adapted, further expanded, and inscribed on papyrus scrolls that were placed in the tombs of the deceased. The New Kingdom texts are known as the Book of the Dead, the most famous and the most widely known body of Egyptian religious literature, a collection of spells and declarations that was derived through a long process of adaptation and expansion from the pyramid texts that were first inscribed in the Pyramid of Unas more than 1,000 years earlier. The individual utterances of the pyramid texts cover a remarkable range of subjects and employ remarkable variety of literary techniques, from simple declarative statements to elaborate mythological narratives, from terse magical formulas to extended poetic compositions that rank among the finest examples of ancient Egyptian literature. The range and the variety of the utterances reflect the diversity of the religious traditions from which they were drawn, and the skill with which the compilers of the collection assembled a body of texts that addressed every aspect of the pharaoh's afterlife journey with a comprehensiveness that no single tradition alone could have provided. The protection spells are among the most common utterances in the collection, spells that were designed to ward off the specific dangers that the pharaoh's spirit would encounter in the afterlife. The dangers included hostile gods and demons, poisonous snakes and scorpions, rivers of fire and fields of knives, and the forces of chaos that threatened to destroy the cosmic order and to prevent the pharaoh from reaching his eternal destination. The protection spells address each danger specifically, naming the threat, describing its nature, and declaring the pharaoh's power to overcome it through the magical potency of the spoken word. The resurrection spells are among the most powerful and most dramatic utterances in the collection. Spells that were designed to revive the pharaoh's body, to restore his consciousness, and to transform him from a dead body lying in a sarcophagus into a living god capable of ascending to the sky and joining the eternal cosmic order. The resurrection spells employ vivid imagery. They describe the pharaoh rising from his coffin, opening his eyes, stretching his limbs, and standing upright in the burial chamber, ready to begin his journey to the stars. The imagery is physical. It describes the process of resurrection in bodily terms, as a literal rising from the dead, a physical transformation from death to life that is accomplished through the power of the words that describe it. The ascension spells describe the pharaoh's journey from the burial chamber to the sky, a journey that is depicted in the texts as both a physical ascent and a spiritual transformation. The pharaoh climbs a ladder to the sky, rides on the wings of a bird, ascends on a column of incense smoke, or is carried upward by the winds. The specific mechanism of the ascent varies from utterance to utterance, reflecting the diversity of the traditions from which the texts were drawn, but the destination is consistent. The pharaoh arrives in the sky, among the stars, in the company of the gods, where he will spend eternity participating in the cosmic cycles of creation and renewal that sustain the universe. The offering spells address the pharaoh's sustenance in the afterlife, the food, the drink, the clothing, and the other provisions that the pharaoh's spirit needs to survive in the eternal realm. Offering spells are closely connected to the ritual of the offering, the daily ceremony in which food and drink were presented to the spirit of the deceased in the mortuary temple, or the offering chapel. The texts transform the ritual into a permanent declaration, a written guarantee that the offerings will be provided, that the pharaoh's spirit will be sustained, and that the provisions of the afterlife will be adequate for the pharaoh's eternal needs. The identification spells are perhaps the most theologically significant utterances in the collection, spells that identify the pharaoh with specific gods, and that claim for him the powers, the attributes, and the cosmic status of those gods. The most important identification is the identification with Osiris, the god of the dead, the ruler of the underworld, the divine prototype of the deceased pharaoh. The identification with Osiris transforms the pharaoh from a dead king into a living god. It elevates his status from mortal to divine, from human to cosmic, from the realm of the dead to the realm of the eternal. The identification is accomplished through language, through the declaration that the pharaoh is Osiris, that the pharaoh's fate is Osiris's fate, and that the pharaoh will share in the eternal life that Osiris enjoys. The fifth exploration examines the causeway of the Pyramid of Unas, the covered corridor connecting the mortuary temple to the valley temple, whose relief decorations provide some of the most remarkable images of Old Kingdom life. The causeway is approximately 750 meters long, one of the longest pyramid causeways in Egypt, and its walls were decorated with relief sculptures that depict a wide variety of subjects, from religious ceremonies and royal activities to scenes of daily life, warfare, and the famous famine scenes that have attracted so much scholarly attention. The reliefs were carved in raised relief, the figures standing out from the background surface in a technique that required considerable skill and that produced images of remarkable clarity and detail. The famine scenes, depicting emaciated figures with protruding ribs, sunken cheeks, and the physical signs of severe malnutrition, are among the most disturbing and most powerful images in all of Egyptian art. The scenes have been interpreted in various ways, as depictions of an actual famine that occurred during Unazi's reign, as representations of foreign peoples, possibly Bedouin from the eastern desert, as symbolic images of the chaos that existed beyond the borders of the ordered Egyptian world, or as ritual scenes that served a specific function within the religious program of the causeway. Whatever their interpretation, the famine scenes represent a departure from the idealized imagery that characterized most Egyptian royal art, a willingness to depict suffering and deprivation that is rare in the context of royal monuments, and that suggests a degree of artistic freedom and social awareness that is remarkable for the period. The cannibal hymn, one of the most extraordinary and most disturbing utterances in the pyramid texts, deserves extended discussion because it illustrates the range and the power of the religious imagination that the texts preserve. The cannibal hymn, found in the Pyramid of Unas and in the later Pyramid of Teti, describes the pharaoh consuming the gods, literally eating them, absorbing their powers, and incorporating their divine attributes into his own being through the act of cosmic cannibalism. The imagery is shocking. The pharaoh is described as a hunter who captures the gods, as a butcher who slaughters them, and as a diner who eats their flesh and drinks their blood, absorbing their powers and becoming, through the act of consumption, the most powerful being in the cosmos. The cannibal hymn has been interpreted in various ways, as a literal description of a ritual practice that involved the consumption of divine substances, as a metaphorical description of the pharaoh's absorption of divine power, as a survival from a very ancient religious tradition that predated the more refined theological systems of the later Old Kingdom, or as a poetic expression of the pharaoh's cosmic supremacy that used the imagery of consumption to convey the totality of his power. The interpretation is debated, but the power of the imagery is undeniable, and the cannibal hymn remains one of the most cited and most discussed utterances in the entire pyramid texts corpus. The cannibal hymn also illustrates the archaic character of some of the pyramid texts, the preservation within the collection of religious traditions that are far older than the Fifth Dynasty context in which they were inscribed. The imagery of divine cannibalism is not consistent with the more refined theological systems of the late Old Kingdom. The solar theology, the stellar theology, and the Osirian theology that dominate the majority of the pyramid texts. The imagery belongs to an older stratum of Egyptian religious thought, a stratum that was preserved in the oral tradition and that was included in the written collection alongside the more recent theological material, creating the juxtaposition of old and new that is one of the most characteristic features of the pyramid texts. The comparison between the pyramid texts and the religious texts of other ancient civilizations provides perspective on the significance and the uniqueness of the Egyptian achievement. The Vedas, the oldest religious texts of the Hindu tradition, are believed to date to roughly the same period as the pyramid texts, though their earliest written versions are much later. The Hebrew Bible, the foundational text of the Jewish and Christian traditions, is significantly later than the pyramid texts, with its oldest components dating to roughly the 8th or 9th century before the Common Era. The comparison demonstrates that the pyramid texts are among the very oldest religious texts in human history, and that the Egyptian scribes who inscribed them on the walls of the Pyramid of Unas were engaged in one of the earliest and most ambitious acts of religious textual preservation in human civilization. The discovery by Maspero in 1881 was itself a dramatic moment in the history of archaeology. a moment that transformed the modern understanding of ancient Egyptian religion, and that opened a new field of study that has occupied scholars for more than a century. Maspero was a young scholar at the time, energetic, ambitious, and convinced that the smaller pyramids of the Fifth and Sixth dynasties held secrets that the larger pyramids of the Fourth Dynasty did not. His conviction was based on reports from local inhabitants who had described finding inscribed surfaces inside the smaller pyramids, reports that Maspero pursued with a determination that was rewarded by one of the most important discoveries in the history of Egyptology. Maspero's initial reaction to the texts was a mixture of excitement and bewilderment. Excitement at the magnitude of the discovery, bewilderment at the difficulty of understanding texts that were written in an archaic form of the Egyptian language, and that described religious concepts that were unfamiliar to the scholarship of the late 19th century. The initial publication of the texts was incomplete. Maspero published a selection of the texts with provisional translations that were later revised and corrected by subsequent scholars. The full publication and the definitive translation of the pyramid texts would occupy scholars for decades, and the process of interpretation, revision, and reinterpretation continues to the present day. The relationship between the pyramid texts and the visual decoration of the burial chamber, the star ceiling, the architectural details, and the overall aesthetic program of the interior reveals a sophisticated integration of verbal and visual elements that was designed to create a total environment for the pharaoh's transformation. The verbal elements, the texts, provided the magical power that drove the transformation. The visual elements, the star ceiling, the architectural framing, provided the cosmic setting in which the transformation took place. The integration of the two produced an experience that was simultaneously literary and architectural, verbal and visual, textual and spatial, an experience that engaged multiple senses and multiple levels of meaning in the service of the single goal of the pharaoh's eternal survival. The star ceiling of the burial chamber deserves detailed attention because it was not merely decorative, it was functional, serving a specific theological purpose within the overall program of the burial chamber. The ceiling was painted to represent the night sky, yellow stars on a dark blue background, arranged in a pattern that evoked the appearance of the celestial vault above the Egyptian landscape. The sky was the pharaoh's destination. The texts on the walls described his ascent to the sky, his journey among the stars, his participation in the cosmic cycles that sustained the universe. The star ceiling placed the destination above the pharaoh's body, creating a spatial relationship between the body, lying in the sarcophagus below, and the destination, depicted on the ceiling above, that physically embodied the theological concept of the ascent from death to eternal life. The relationship between the pyramid texts and the subsequent development of tomb decoration in Egypt illuminates the long-term consequences of the innovation that the Pyramid of Unas introduced. The inscription of texts on the walls of the burial chamber established a precedent that subsequent pharaohs followed and that subsequent generations adapted and extended to create the extensive body of funerary literature and tomb decoration that characterizes the Egyptian burial tradition. From the late Old Kingdom onward, the Sixth Dynasty pyramids, the pyramids of Teti, Pepi I, Merenri, and Pepi II, followed the precedent of the Pyramid of Unas by inscribing pyramid texts on the walls of their burial chambers. Each successive pyramid expanded the corpus, adding new utterances that had not appeared in the Pyramid of Unas, and arranging the existing utterances in new configurations that reflected the specific theological emphases and the specific ritual requirements of each pharaoh's funerary program. The expansion of the corpus demonstrates the vitality of the tradition, the continuing capacity of the Egyptian religious establishment to compose new texts, to integrate new theological concepts, and to adapt the existing corpus to the changing needs and the changing circumstances of successive reigns. The specific examples of individual utterances from the pyramid texts illustrate the range and the power of the religious literature that the collection contains. One of the most famous utterances is Utterance 217, the so-called Stairway to Heaven text, which describes the pharaoh ascending to the sky on a stairway that connects the earth to the heavens. The text is vivid in its imagery. The pharaoh climbs the stairway, step by step, rising from the burial chamber to the celestial realm, assisted by the gods who reach down to pull him upward and who welcome him into their company. The stairway image may be connected to the step pyramid form. The stepped profile of the earlier pyramids may have been understood as a physical representation of the cosmic stairway that the text describes, a connection that would link the architectural form of the pyramid to the textual imagery of the pyramid texts in a single integrated symbolic system. Another famous utterance is Utterance 269, a resurrection spell in which the pharaoh is commanded to rise from his coffin, to open his eyes, and to stand upright in preparation for his journey to the sky. The utterance addresses the pharaoh directly, using the imperative mood, commanding him to act, demanding that he overcome the passivity of death and assert the vitality of divine life. The directness of the address is characteristic of the pyramid texts. The texts do not describe the pharaoh's resurrection from a distance, but address him as a participant, commanding him to take the actions that will produce his transformation from dead body to living God. The offering spells, the utterances that address the pharaoh's sustenance in the afterlife, are among the most practically oriented texts in the collection. They list specific foods and specific drinks, bread, beer, meat, fruit, wine, and other provisions that the pharaoh's spirit would need to survive in the eternal realm. The lists are detailed. They specify the quantities, the types, and the qualities of the provisions that are to be offered, creating a comprehensive menu of spiritual sustenance that addresses every aspect of the pharaoh's dietary needs in the afterlife. The specificity of the lists reflects the Egyptian belief that the afterlife was a physical existence, that the pharaoh's spirit needed real food and real drink to survive, and that the provision of these necessities was as important in death as it had been in life. The physical process of inscribing the pyramid text on the walls of the burial chamber was a feat of craftsmanship that required the collaboration of scribes, stone carvers, and painters working in the confined and dimly lit space of the underground chambers. The process began with the preparation of the wall surface, the smoothing and the leveling of the limestone, to create a flat, uniform surface that would receive the carved hieroglyphs. The preparation was done by masons who used copper chisels and stone abrasives to remove the irregularities and to create the smooth surface that the carvers required. The layout of the text was done by scribes who used red ochre to draw the guidelines, the horizontal and vertical lines that defined the columns within which the hieroglyphs would be. The guidelines were essential. They ensured that the columns were straight, that the hieroglyphs were evenly spaced, and that the overall visual effect was orderly and aesthetically pleasing. The scribes who drew the guidelines were working from a master document, a papyrus or a limestone tablet, on which the texts had been written in their intended arrangement, providing a template that the scribes could follow as they laid out the inscriptions on the walls. The carving was done by specialist stone carvers who used copper chisels and small wooden mallets to cut the hieroglyphs into the limestone surface. The carving required precision. Each hieroglyph had to be cut to the correct shape, the correct depth, and the correct proportions, with clean edges and consistent dimensions that would produce a legible and aesthetically satisfying result. The carvers worked in the confined space of the burial chamber, a space that was illuminated by oil lamps or torches that produced flickering, uneven light, and that created smoke that must have made the work physically uncomfortable. The conditions were not ideal, but the results were excellent, producing hieroglyphs of a quality that demonstrates the skill and the dedication of the craftsmen who executed the work. The painting, the application of the blue-green pigment that filled the carved hieroglyphs, was the final stage of the inscription process. The pigment was a mixture of finely ground copper minerals, probably malachite or chrysocolla, suspended in a binding medium that allowed the pigment to be applied with a brush, and that held the pigment in place after it dried. The blue-green colour was deliberate. It was the colour of the Nile floodwaters, the colour of vegetation, the color of renewal and rebirth, and it was chosen for its symbolic associations with the life-giving forces that the texts were designed to invoke. The color transformed the carved hieroglyphs from incisions in pale limestone into vivid, colorful signs that stood out from the wall surface, and that created the visual impact that visitors to the burial chamber still experience today. The time required for the complete inscription of the pyramid texts, from the preparation of the wall surfaces to the final application of the pigment, has been estimated by scholars at several months to a year, depending on the number of craftsmen employed and the pace of the work. The estimate is based on modern experiments in which craftsmen have attempted to replicate the carving techniques of the ancient Egyptians. Experiments that have revealed that the carving of a single hieroglyph in limestone takes approximately 15 to 30 minutes, depending on the size and the complexity of the sign, and that the carving of the entire collection of 228 utterances would require thousands of hours of concentrated labor. The relationship between the pyramid texts and the development of the Egyptian concept of the individual soul deserves attention because the texts contain some of the earliest and most detailed descriptions of the components of the human spiritual identity. The ka, the ba, the ak, the shadow, and the name that the Egyptian religious system identified as the essential elements of the human being and that needed to be preserved and sustained for the individual to survive in the afterlife. The ka, the spiritual double, the vital force that accompanied every Egyptian from birth to death, and that continued to exist after death in the tomb, is one of the most frequently mentioned spiritual components in the pyramid texts. The ka needed physical sustenance, food and drink that were provided through the offering cult and through the offering spells that guaranteed the continued provision of sustenance even if the cult ceased to function. The pyramid texts contain numerous utterances that address the ka directly, providing it with the nourishment it needs, protecting it from the forces that threaten to weaken or destroy it, and ensuring that the connection between the ka and the body is maintained for eternity. The ba, the aspect of the soul that could move freely between the tomb and the wider world, often depicted as a bird with a human head, is described in the pyramid texts as the element of the pharaoh's spiritual identity that makes the afterlife journey, ascending from the burial chamber to the sky and traversing the cosmic landscape that the texts describe. The ba's freedom of movement was essential. It was the element that allowed the pharaoh to participate in the cosmic cycles of creation and renewal, while maintaining its connection to the body that was housed in the burial chamber below. The pyramid texts contain utterances that facilitate the ba's movement, spells that open the doors of the sky, that calm the guardians of the cosmic gates, and that ensure that the ba's passage through the afterlife landscape is unobstructed. The ak, the transfigured spirit, the luminous form that the pharaoh attained after the successful completion of the transformation from mortal to immortal, is described in the pyramid texts as the ultimate goal of the afterlife journey, the final state of being that the spells and the declarations are designed to produce. The ak was a glorified form of existence, a state of divine luminosity in which the pharaoh participated fully in the cosmic order and in which the distinctions between the human and the divine were dissolved. The transformation into an ak was not automatic. It required the successful performance of the spells and the rituals that the pyramid texts prescribe, and it depended on the correct execution of the funerary program that the texts describe. The serpent spells, the utterances that address the danger of snakes in the afterlife, are among the most vivid and the most frequently recurring texts in the collection. The Egyptian afterlife was populated by serpents, dangerous, venomous creatures that lurked in the passages of the underworld and that threatened to bite and to poison the pharaoh's spirit as it made its way to the celestial realm. The serpent spells address these creatures directly, commanding them to retreat, threatening them with divine retribution, and declaring the pharaoh's power to crush them underfoot and to pass safely through the domains they guard. The frequency of the serpent spells suggests that the danger of serpents was one of the most prominent features of the Egyptian conception of the afterlife. a danger that was taken seriously enough to warrant multiple spells and multiple approaches to the problem of serpentine threat. The spells addressing the ferryman, the divine being who operates the boat that carries the deceased across the celestial waterway that separates the earthly realm from the realm of the gods, are among the most narratively complex utterances in the collection. The ferryman must be persuaded to carry the pharaoh across the water, and the persuasion requires the pharaoh to demonstrate his worthiness, his divine status, and his knowledge of the correct passwords and the correct ritual formulas that the ferryman demands. The ferryman spells are dialogue texts. They present a conversation between the pharaoh and the ferryman in which the pharaoh answers questions, recites formulas, and demonstrates the specific knowledge that qualifies him for passage. The dialogue form is relatively rare in the broader pyramid texts corpus. Most of the utterances are monologues or declarations rather than conversations, and the ferryman's spells provide a glimpse of a more dramatic and more narratively sophisticated literary tradition that may have existed alongside the more formal declarative tradition. The astronomical references in the pyramid texts, the references to specific stars, specific constellations, and specific celestial phenomena, provide valuable evidence for the Egyptian knowledge of astronomy and for the role that astronomical observation played in the development of the Egyptian religious system. The texts mention the circumpolar stars, the stars that never set below the horizon and that were identified as the imperishable ones, the eternal beings with whom the pharaoh would spend eternity. The texts mention Orion, the constellation that was identified with the god Osiris and that served as the important celestial counterpart of the divine king of the underworld. The texts mention Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, identified with the goddess Isis and closely associated with the annual flooding of the Nile that renewed the fertility of the Egyptian land. The legacy of the pyramid texts extends beyond Egypt to the broader history of world religion, because the texts preserve religious concepts and ritual practices that are among the earliest documented expressions of the human confrontation with death and the hope of transcending it. The concepts include the belief in the survival of the soul beyond the death of the body, the belief in the transformation of the deceased into a divine being, the belief in the power of words and rituals to affect the spiritual realm, and the belief in the existence of a cosmic order that governs the relationship between the living and the dead. These concepts are not unique to Egypt. They appear in various forms in the religious traditions of every human civilization, but the Egyptian expression of these concepts is the earliest documented expression. The first time in human history that these beliefs were committed to writing in a form that has survived to the present day. The study of the pyramid text has influenced the modern understanding of the origins and the development of religious thought, providing evidence for the antiquity and the universality of the religious concepts that the texts preserve and demonstrating that the human confrontation with death has been a central concern of human civilization since the very earliest stages of its development. The texts have also influenced the modern understanding of the relationship between religion and writing, demonstrating that the technology of writing was applied to the preservation of religious literature at a very early stage of its development, and that the desire to preserve religious knowledge was one of the primary motivations for the development and the refinement of the writing system. The expansion of the corpus also provides evidence for the scholarly study of the development of Egyptian religious thought during the late Old Kingdom, because the differences between the text collections in successive pyramids reflect the theological developments that occurred during the intervening reigns. The most important development was the increasing prominence of the Osirian theology, the identification of the dead pharaoh with Osiris, and the elaboration of the myths and the rituals associated with the Osirian cycle of death, resurrection, and eternal rule in the underworld. The Osirian theology was present in the Pyramid of Unas, but it became more prominent in the later collections, eventually becoming the dominant theological framework for the Egyptian understanding of death and the afterlife. The transition from the pyramid texts to the coffin texts The transition from the royal texts of the Old Kingdom pyramids to the non-royal texts of the Middle Kingdom coffins was one of the most significant cultural transformations in the history of Egyptian civilization. The transformation involved not merely the transfer of the texts from one medium to another, from pyramid walls to coffin surfaces, but the fundamental democratization of the afterlife, the extension of the spiritual protection that had been the exclusive privilege of the pharaoh to the broader population of nobles, officials, and eventually ordinary Egyptians. The democratization was gradual. It did not occur suddenly or completely at any single moment. The coffin texts of the early Middle Kingdom were restricted to the tombs of the elite, the highest-ranking nobles and officials, who had the resources and the religious authority to claim the spiritual protection that the text provided. The later coffin texts were available to a wider audience. As the democratization extended down the social hierarchy, and as the belief that all Egyptians, regardless of rank, were entitled to the spiritual protection of the funerary texts became more widely accepted. The Book of the Dead, the final stage in the chain of transmission that begins with the pyramid texts, was the most widely distributed form of the Egyptian funerary literature, available on papyrus scrolls that could be purchased from temple scribes and placed in the tombs of anyone who could afford them. The Book of the Dead represents the fullest expression of the democratization, the point at which the spiritual protection that had been the exclusive privilege of the pharaoh in the Pyramid of Unas was available, at least in principle, to every Egyptian who desired it. The sixth exploration examines what the Pyramid of Unas tells us about the nature of the transition from the Fifth Dynasty to the Sixth Dynasty, the political and religious changes that accompanied the end of the Fifth Dynasty and the beginning of the Sixth. Unas was the last pharaoh of the Fifth Dynasty, and his death marked the end of a dynasty that had ruled Egypt for roughly a century and a half. The transition to the Sixth Dynasty was peaceful. There was no revolution, no invasion, no dramatic upheaval, but the transition involved changes in the ruling family, and possibly in the political structures that supported the monarchy. The pyramid texts may have been part of the political dimension of the transition, a demonstration of religious authority and theological innovation that legitimized the new dynasty by establishing its connection to the divine order through the most powerful medium available, the written word. Step back now from the hieroglyphs and the pigments and the archaeological debates. Step back from the Pyramid of Unas as a building and look at it as something else, as a turning point, the most important turning point in the history of Egyptian religion. Perhaps one of the most important turning points in the history of human civilization. The turning point was this: the recognition that words are more powerful than stone. The recognition was revolutionary, because it overturned the fundamental assumption on which the entire pyramid building tradition had been built. The assumption was that the pharaoh's eternal survival depended on the physical permanence of his tomb, on the mass of the stone, the thickness of the walls, the endurance of the structure that housed his body. The assumption had driven the construction of the pyramids for centuries. From the step pyramid through the Great Pyramid, the logic had been consistent. Bigger is better, more stone is more protection, and the pharaoh who builds the largest tomb has the best chance of surviving for eternity. The Pyramid of Unas challenged this assumption, not by arguing against it, but by supplementing it with an alternative. The alternative was text, the written word, inscribed on the walls of the burial chamber in permanent hieroglyphic form, carrying the power of the spoken ritual in a medium that was as durable as the stone itself, but that was capable of conveying meaning in a way that stone alone could not. The text did not replace the architecture. The Pyramid of Unas was still a pyramid, still a stone structure designed to protect the pharaoh's body for eternity, but the text added a dimension to the protection that the architecture alone could not provide, the dimension of meaning, of language, of the specific, articulated, verbally expressed religious beliefs that defined the pharaoh's relationship to the gods and that ensured his transformation from mortal to immortal. Let that sink in. the addition of text to the architectural program of the pyramid was not merely a decorative change. It was a conceptual revolution, a fundamental shift in the understanding of how the pharaoh's eternal survival was to be achieved. The shift had profound implications that would unfold over the next 2,000 years, and that would transform the Egyptian funerary tradition from an architectural tradition, in which the tomb was the primary instrument of eternal survival, to a literary tradition, in which the text was the primary instrument and the tomb was merely the container for the text. This is not science fiction. This is the actual history of one of the most important cultural transformations in human civilization. The transformation from a culture that relied on physical structures to ensure the survival of the soul to a culture that relied on written words. The transformation began in the Pyramid of Unas. It continued through the coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom and the Book of the Dead of the New Kingdom, and it culminated in a funerary tradition in which the text, the scroll, the book, the written word, was more important than the tomb in which it was placed. Let that sink in. The recognition that words are more powerful than stone is not unique to the Pyramid of Unas. It is a recognition that has been reached by every civilization that has developed the technology of writing, but the Pyramid of Unas is the earliest and the most dramatic expression of this recognition, because it places the texts inside the most monumental and the most architecturally ambitious structure that the civilization had developed, creating a synthesis of architecture and literature that is without precedent in the ancient world. The synthesis is the Pyramid of Unas's most important contribution to the history of human civilization. Not the texts alone, not the architecture alone, but the combination of the two, the integration of the written word into the architectural program of the most sacred structure in the Egyptian religious system. The integration had consequences that extended far beyond the specific context of the Pyramid of Unas, consequences that would shape the development of Egyptian funerary religion for the next 2,000 years. The most important consequence was the democratization of the afterlife, the gradual extension of the funerary texts from the exclusive preserve of the pharaoh to the broader population of nobles, officials, and eventually ordinary Egyptians who aspired to the same kind of spiritual protection that the pharaoh enjoyed. The democratization began during the First Intermediate Period and the Middle Kingdom, when the pyramid texts were adapted and inscribed on the coffins of non-royal individuals, creating the body of literature known as the coffin texts. The democratization continued during the New Kingdom, when the funerary texts were further adapted and inscribed on papyrus scrolls that were placed in the tombs of individuals of all social classes, creating the Book of the Dead that is the most widely known body of Egyptian religious literature. The modern study of the pyramid texts has been transformed in recent decades by the application of new analytical methods that have allowed scholars to examine the texts in ways that were not possible for earlier generations, and that have produced new insights into the composition, the transmission, and the meaning of the individual utterances. The most important of these methods is the comparative analysis of the multiple versions of individual utterances, the comparison of the versions that appear in the Pyramid of Unas with the versions that appear in the later pyramids of the Sixth Dynasty, identifying the variations, the additions, and the omissions that reveal the development of the textual tradition across successive reigns. The comparative analysis has revealed that the textual tradition was not static, it was dynamic, evolving through a process of continuous revision and adaptation that reflected the changing theological emphases and the changing ritual requirements of successive pharaohs. The analysis has also revealed that the scribes who copied the texts were not passive copyists. They were active editors who modified the texts according to specific principles and specific purposes, adding new material, rearranging existing material, and correcting or updating passages that were considered to be outdated or inappropriate for the current pharaoh's funerary program. The digital humanities have also contributed to the study of the pyramid texts, providing tools for the organization, the analysis, and the visualization of the textual data that have made it possible to study the corpus as a whole rather than as a collection of individual utterances. The digital tools have facilitated the identification of patterns, patterns of word usage, patterns of textual arrangement, patterns of thematic association that are difficult to detect through the traditional methods of close reading, and that reveal structural features of the corpus that earlier scholars had not perceived. The relationship between the pyramid texts and the broader intellectual history of ancient Egypt, the development of writing, the growth of literacy, the emergence of literature as distinct cultural practice, provides additional context for understanding the significance of the texts and their place in the history of Egyptian civilization. The pyramid texts were produced at a specific moment in the development of Egyptian literacy, a moment when the technology of writing had matured to the point where it could be applied to the preservation of complex religious literature, and when the scribal class had developed the skills and the conventions that were needed for the inscription of texts on the walls of monumental buildings. The moment was not inevitable. It was the product of specific historical developments, specific institutional investments, and specific individual decisions that converged to produce the conditions under which the inscription of the pyramid texts became possible. The chain of transmission, from the pyramid texts to the coffin texts to the Book of the Dead, is one of the most impressive examples of textual continuity in human history, extending across more than 2,000 years and encompassing hundreds of individual texts that were composed, copied, adapted, and reinterpreted by generations of scribes and priests who maintained the literary tradition across the political upheavals, the social transformations, and the religious developments that characterized the long history of Egyptian civilization. The chain begins in the Pyramid of Unas, in the blue-green hieroglyphs that cover the walls of the burial chamber, and it extends to the papyrus scrolls of the Ptolemaic period more than 2 millennia later, in a continuous thread of textual transmission that is unmatched in the ancient world. The pyramid texts also raise questions about the nature of authorship and textual authority in the ancient world, questions that connect the study of the texts to the broader field of literary theory and that illuminate the specific character of ancient literary production. The pyramid texts are anonymous. No individual author is identified, no individual scribe is named, and no individual priest is credited with the composition of the utterances that the collection contains. The anonymity is characteristic of ancient religious literature. The texts were understood to be the product of divine inspiration or sacred tradition rather than individual creativity, and the identification of a human author would have diminished rather than enhanced their authority. The anonymity also reflects the collective character of the composition process. The fact that the texts were produced not by a single individual, but by a tradition, by a community of religious specialists who contributed to the corpus over generations and who understood their individual contributions as additions to a shared body of sacred knowledge, rather than as personal expressions of individual belief. The collective authorship is one of the most important features of the pyramid texts. It means that the texts represent not the beliefs of a single individual, but the beliefs of a community, not the theology of a single period, but the theology of multiple periods, and not the product of a single creative act, but the accumulated product of centuries of religious thought and ritual practice. The question of how the pyramid texts were transmitted from the oral tradition to the written form, the specific process by which the spoken spells were transformed into carved inscriptions, is a question that illuminates the practical dimension of the textual innovation. The process probably involved several stages. The collection of the oral texts by scribes who took dictation from the priests who knew the spells, the compilation of the collected texts into a written document that could serve as a master copy, the selection and the arrangement of the texts according to the spatial program of the burial chamber, and the final carving and painting of the selected texts on the walls of the chamber by the specialized craftsmen who possessed the technical skills needed for stone inscription. Each stage of the process required specific skills and specific knowledge. The scribes needed to know how to write, the compilers needed to know theology, the arrangers needed to know the spatial program, and the craftsman needed to know how to carve. The process was collaborative. It involved multiple specialists working together to produce a result that no single individual could have produced alone. The collaboration was itself an expression of the institutional sophistication of the late Fifth Dynasty state, a demonstration that the Egyptian administrative and religious establishments were capable of organizing and executing complex, multi-stage projects that required the coordination of diverse skills and diverse knowledge. The pyramid texts have also influenced the modern understanding of the development of Egyptian art. Because the hieroglyphs themselves are works of art, carved images that represent not merely sounds and concepts, but animals, plants, objects, and human figures that are rendered with the same attention to naturalistic detail and the same aesthetic sensitivity that characterizes the finest examples of Egyptian visual art. The hieroglyphs in the Pyramid of Unas are among the most beautifully carved examples of the hieroglyphic script. Each sign is a miniature sculpture, a small-scale representation of the thing it depicts, executed with a precision and a beauty that transcend the merely functional requirements of the writing system. The beauty of the hieroglyphs is not incidental, it is integral to their function, because the Egyptian writing system was understood to be not merely a recording system, but a system of magical signs, whose power was enhanced by the quality and the accuracy of their execution. A hieroglyph that accurately depicted the thing it represented was more powerful than one that depicted it inaccurately, because the accuracy of the depiction strengthened the connection between the sign and the thing, and the strength of the connection determined the magnitude of the magical effect that the sign could produce. The craftsmen who carved the hieroglyphs in the Pyramid of Unas were therefore not merely scribes, they were artists, practitioners of a visual craft that was as essential to the magical function of the texts as the verbal content of the utterances themselves. The relationship between the visual quality of the hieroglyphs and their magical efficacy raises questions about the nature of Egyptian aesthetics. Questions about whether the Egyptian concern with visual beauty was primarily aesthetic, concerned with the creation of pleasing visual effects for their own sake, or primarily functional, concerned with the creation of accurate representations that maximize the magical power of the sign. The answer is probably both. The Egyptians valued visual beauty as both an aesthetic quality and a functional requirement, recognizing that beautiful signs were more powerful signs, and that the investment in visual quality was an investment in magical efficacy. The pyramid texts have also contributed to the modern understanding of the Egyptian conception of the cosmos, the Egyptian model of the universe, with its multiple levels, its multiple inhabitants, and its complex web of relationships between the gods, the dead, and the living. The texts describe a cosmos that is vast, complex, and populated by a multitude of divine and semi-divine beings. A cosmos in which the pharaoh's spirit must navigate a landscape of dangers and opportunities, aided by the spells and the declarations that the texts provide. The cosmic landscape that the texts describe is one of the most elaborate and most detailed models of the universe in the ancient world. A model that reveals the sophistication and the imagination of the Egyptian religious thinkers who conceived it, and that provides a comprehensive framework for understanding the Egyptian relationship to death, to the gods, and to the forces that govern the cosmos. The question of what the pyramid texts reveal about the Egyptian understanding of the relationship between words and reality, between language and the world that language describes, is one of the most philosophically significant questions that the texts raise. The pyramid texts operate on the assumption that words have the power to create reality, that a correctly spoken or correctly inscribed spell can produce real effects in the real world, that the declaration of a fact makes the fact true, and that the naming of a thing brings the thing into existence. The assumption is not metaphorical, it is literal, a genuine belief in the creative power of language that was one of the foundational principles of the Egyptian religious system. The belief in the creative power of language is one of the most distinctive features of ancient Egyptian thought, and it is a feature that connects the pyramid texts to the deepest questions in the philosophy of language. Questions about the relationship between words and things, between signs and their reference, between the symbolic system of language and the physical world that language represents. The Egyptian answer to these questions was radical. It asserted that the relationship between words and things was not merely representational but causal, that words do not merely describe reality but create it, and that the correct use of language is therefore one of the most powerful tools available to human beings for the control and the transformation of the world. The pyramid texts also provide evidence for the Egyptian understanding of the relationship between the living and the dead, the ongoing connection between the world of the living and the world of the dead that the Egyptian religious system maintained through the offering cult and the funerary rituals. The texts describe a relationship that is reciprocal. The living sustain the dead through offerings and prayers, and the dead protect the living through their divine intercession and their cosmic authority. The reciprocity is deeply fundamental to the Egyptian worldview. It creates a bond between the generations that extends across the boundary of death, and that ensures the continued welfare of both the living and the dead. The pyramid texts are the permanent and enduring record of this sacred bond. The inscription of the promises and the obligations that connect the pharaoh to his people and his people to their pharaoh across the profound boundary of death and into the infinite reaches of eternity. The modern reception of the pyramid texts, the way that the texts have been understood, interpreted, and valued by the modern world since their discovery in 1881, provides a final dimension of the Pyramid of Unas' significance. The texts have been received with fascination by scholars who have devoted their careers to the study of the individual utterances, by the public who have encountered the texts through popular books and documentaries, and by religious thinkers who have seen in the texts evidence for the antiquity and the universality of the human religious impulse. The fascination is justified. The pyramid texts are one of the most remarkable bodies of literature in human history, a collection that preserves the religious beliefs and the ritual practices of one of the earliest and most sophisticated civilizations in a form that is still accessible, still comprehensible, and still capable of illuminating the human condition more than 4,300 years after they were first inscribed on the walls of a pharaoh's tomb. The question of what the pyramid texts mean for the modern understanding of the human relationship to death and to the hope of continued existence beyond death is a question that connects the ancient texts to the deepest and most universal concerns of the human condition. Every human culture has developed beliefs about what happens after death, beliefs that reflect the specific religious, philosophical, and cultural traditions of the culture, and that provide comfort, meaning, and hope in the face of the ultimate certainty of human mortality. The pyramid texts are one of the earliest and most elaborate expressions of these beliefs, a comprehensive system of spells, prayers, and declarations that was designed to address every aspect of the pharaoh's journey from death to eternal life, and that reveals in extraordinary detail the specific ways in which one of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history confronted the reality of death and imagined the possibility of overcoming it. The pyramid texts do not provide comfort in the modern sense. They are not reassuring, they are not gentle, and they do not promise the kind of peaceful, heavenly afterlife that later religious traditions would describe. The afterlife that the pyramid texts describe is dangerous. It is filled with hostile beings, treacherous landscapes, and cosmic forces that threaten to destroy the pharaoh's spirit before it can reach its eternal destination. The spells are defensive. They are weapons, tools, instruments of spiritual combat that the pharaoh needs to survive the journey and to overcome the obstacles that the afterlife presents. The tone is urgent. The texts convey a sense of cosmic danger and cosmic stakes that is far removed from the serene and the comforting vision of the afterlife that later traditions would develop. The grief moment of the Pyramid of Unas is the paradox at its center. The paradox that the smallest pyramid of the Old Kingdom contains the most enduring legacy of the Old Kingdom. The Great Pyramid is larger. The Great Pyramid is more famous. The Great Pyramid is more impressive in every physical dimension, but the Great Pyramid's walls are blank. They carry no message. They preserve no words. They transmit no meaning across the millennia. The Pyramid of Unas is smaller, less famous, and less impressive, but its walls speak. They carry a message that has been transmitted across more than 4,300 years. A message that has been read, studied, translated, and analysed by scholars in every country and every language. A message that is as alive today as it was when the blue-green pigment was first applied to the freshly carved hieroglyphs in the burial chamber of the last pharaoh of the Fifth Dynasty. The Pyramid of Unas stands at Saqqara, a modest mound of eroded limestone, barely recognisable as a pyramid, surrounded by the remains of its mortuary temple, its causeway, and the tombs of the officials who served the pharaoh in life and who were buried near him in death. The exterior is unpromising. It does not attract the attention of tourists who are drawn to the more impressive monuments of the plateau, and it does not feature prominently in the popular imagination of ancient Egypt. The Pyramid of Unas is a building that must be entered to be understood, because its significance lies not in its exterior form, but in its interior content, not in the stone that constitutes its mass, but in the words that are inscribed on its walls. The implications of the pyramid texts extend far beyond the specific context of Egyptian funerary religion. They extend to the broadest questions about the relationship between architecture and language, between physical structures and written texts, between the things we build and the things we write. The pyramid texts demonstrate that writing has a power that architecture does not, the power to convey meaning across time, to communicate specific ideas and specific beliefs to audiences that the writer could not have imagined, and to survive the destruction of the physical context in which the writing was originally placed. The pyramid has crumbled, the texts have survived, the architecture has failed, the literature has endured. The demonstration is relevant to the modern world, because the modern world faces its own version of the question that the Pyramid of Unas addressed. The question of how to preserve knowledge, meaning, and cultural identity across time. The modern world builds structures, buildings, monuments, infrastructure that are designed to last. But the modern world also produces texts, books, documents, digital records that are designed to preserve knowledge and to transmit it to future generations. The Pyramid of Unas suggests that the texts are more important than the structures, that the words will outlast the buildings, that the meaning will outlast the mass, and that the investment in writing is a better investment in the future than the investment in construction. The archaeological conservation of the Pyramid of Unas presents specific challenges that are different from the challenges at other pyramid sites, challenges that are primarily concerned with the preservation of the texts rather than the preservation of the architecture. The texts are the pyramid's most important feature, and their preservation requires the management of the environmental conditions inside the burial chamber in ways that are not necessary for pyramids whose walls are blank. The humidity, the temperature, the air circulation, and the visitor traffic inside the chamber all affect the condition of the texts. The pigment that fills the carved hieroglyphs is sensitive to moisture, to temperature fluctuations, and to the physical contact that can occur when visitors touch the walls. The management of these conditions requires a conservation program that is tailored to the specific needs of inscribed surfaces rather than to the general needs of stone structures. The visitor experience at the Pyramid of Unas, the experience of descending the entrance passage, entering the antechamber, and then entering the burial chamber to see the pyramid texts on the walls, is one of the most moving and most intellectually rewarding experiences available to visitors at Saqqara. The texts are visible. The blue-green pigment still fills many of the carved signs, creating columns of hieroglyphs that are legible to anyone who can read the ancient script and that are visually striking to anyone who cannot. The star ceiling above the burial chamber is still partially preserved. The yellow stars on the dark blue background creating the appearance of the night sky above the pharaoh's resting place. The combination of the texts and the ceiling creates the total environment that the builders intended, a space in which the verbal power of the religious texts and the visual imagery of the cosmic realm combined to to produce the conditions for the pharaoh's transformation from death to eternal life. The relationship between the Pyramid of Unas and the other inscribed pyramids at Saqqara, the pyramids of Teti, Pepi I, Merenra, and Pepi II, all of which contain pyramid texts, creates an archaeological resource of extraordinary richness, a cluster of inscribed monuments that together preserve the largest and the most diverse collection of Old Kingdom religious literature in existence. Each pyramid contains its own selection of texts, drawn from the same corpus, but arranged differently and supplemented with different additional utterances, creating variations that allow scholars to study the development and the adaptation of the textual tradition across multiple ruins and multiple generations. The scholarly study of the pyramid texts has been one of the most sustained and most productive endeavours in the history of Egyptology, an effort that has involved generations of scholars working in multiple languages and multiple countries, and that has produced a body of analysis that is among the most sophisticated in the entire field of ancient studies. The foundational work was done by Kurt Setti, a German Egyptologist who published the first comprehensive edition of the pyramid texts in the early 20th century, providing a text that included all of the known versions from all of the inscribed pyramids, and that established the numbering system and the editorial conventions that scholars continue to use. Subsequent scholars, including Raymond Faulkner, James Allen, and Harold Hayes, have produced new translations, new interpretations, and new analyses that have deepened and enriched the understanding of the texts, and that have revealed dimensions of meaning that Sethi's pioneering work had not fully explored. The ongoing nature of the scholarly engagement with the pyramid texts reflects the depth and the complexity of the material, a complexity that ensures that each generation of scholars discovers new insights and new connections that previous generations had not perceived. The texts are not simple. They resist easy interpretation. They contain layers of meaning that unfold gradually over years of study, and they preserve religious concepts that are alien to the modern understanding and that require sustained effort to comprehend. The difficulty of the texts is part of their fascination, and the fascination has sustained more than a century of scholarly engagement that shows no sign of diminishing. The relationship between the pyramid texts and the modern study of ancient Egyptian religion is one of the most productive relationships in the history of humanistic scholarship. The texts have provided scholars with a window into the religious beliefs of the Old Kingdom that is unmatched by any other source, a window that reveals the specific details of the Egyptian understanding of death, the afterlife, the gods, and the cosmic order with a clarity and a specificity that the architectural and the artistic evidence cannot match. The texts have been studied, translated, and analysed by generations of scholars, and the analysis has produced a body of knowledge about ancient Egyptian religion that is among the most detailed and the most sophisticated in the entire field of ancient studies. The question of what the Pyramid of Unas means for the modern understanding of the relationship between physical structures and written texts, between architecture and literature, between the things we build and the things we write, is one that connects the ancient monument to the deepest concerns of contemporary culture. The modern world produces both structures and texts, buildings and books, monuments and manuscripts, physical artifacts and written records, and the question of which is more durable, which is more valuable, and which is more likely to survive the passage of time, is a question that the Pyramid of Unas addresses with a clarity and a directness that is remarkable for a monument that is more than 4,300 years old. The answer that the Pyramid of Unas provides is unambiguous. The texts have outlasted the structure. The walls on which the texts are inscribed are still standing, but the pyramid that surrounds those walls has crumbled, its casing stripped, its core eroded, its exterior reduced to a mound that is barely recognizable as a royal monument. The structure has failed, but the texts have not. The texts are still there, still legible, still carrying the message that they were designed to carry. The survival of the texts within the failed structure is the most powerful possible demonstration of the relative durability of words and stone, and it suggests that the investment in writing may be a better investment in the future. than the investment in construction. The conservation of the pyramid texts. The ongoing effort to preserve the inscriptions against the forces of deterioration that threaten to destroy them is one of the most important and most challenging conservation tasks in Egyptian archaeology. The texts are inscribed on limestone, a material that is durable under favorable conditions, but that is susceptible to damage from moisture, temperature fluctuations, salt crystallization, and biological growth under unfavorable conditions. The conditions inside the burial chamber of the Pyramid of Unas are not ideal. The chamber is subject to seasonal variations in temperature and humidity that can cause the limestone to expand and contract, loosening the pigment and causing the carved surfaces to flake and deteriorate. The visitor who enters the Pyramid of Unas today and descends to the burial chamber encounters a space that has not fundamentally changed since the day the chamber was sealed more than 4,300 years ago. The walls are still inscribed. The columns of hieroglyphs still march across the limestone surfaces, their blue-green pigment faded in places, but still visible, still legible, still carrying the utterances that were designed to protect the pharaoh and to ensure his transformation from mortal to immortal. The star ceiling is still partially preserved, the yellow stars on the dark blue background, still evoking the cosmic realm to which the pharaoh's spirit was destined to ascend. The sarcophagus is still in place, empty now, its contents removed by ancient tomb robbers, but still occupying the position against the western wall where it was placed more than 4 millennia ago. The experience is intimate, more intimate than the experience of visiting the Great Pyramid, whose vast, empty chambers dwarf the visitor and create a sense of cosmic scale that overwhelms the individual. The Pyramid of Unas is smaller, its chambers are more human in scale, its passages are more accessible, and the inscriptions on its walls invite the visitor to read, to study, and to engage with the texts in a way that the blank walls of the Great Pyramid do not permit. The intimacy is the Pyramid of Unas's greatest gift to the modern visitor. The opportunity to stand in the presence of the oldest religious texts in human history and to experience, however imperfectly, the total environment of text and architecture and cosmic imagery that the builders created for the pharaoh's eternal protection. The conservation measures that have been implemented at the Pyramid of Unas include the control of visitor access, limiting the number of visitors who enter the burial chamber at any given time to reduce the moisture and the carbon dioxide that human presence introduces into the enclosed environment. The measures also include the monitoring of the environmental conditions inside the chamber. The temperature, the humidity, and the air quality are measured continuously, and the data are used to assess the condition of the inscriptions and to identify periods of elevated risk when additional protective measures may be needed. The suggestion has implications for the modern world, implications that are relevant to the contemporary debates about how to preserve knowledge, how to transmit cultural identity, and how to ensure that the achievements of the present are available to the future. The modern world invests heavily in physical infrastructure, in buildings, in monuments, in the material structures that provide the physical framework for civilized life. The modern world also invests in written records, in books, in documents, in digital archives that preserve the knowledge and the culture of the present for the benefit of the future. The Pyramid of Unas suggests that the second investment may be more important than the first, that the written records will outlast the physical structures, that the knowledge preserved in text will survive the collapse of the infrastructure that houses it, and that the words will endure when the stone has crumbled. The suggestion is not absolute. It does not mean that physical structures are unimportant or that investment in infrastructure is wasted. The suggestion is comparative. It means that the relative priority of the two investments should be carefully considered, that the preservation of knowledge in written form should be valued as highly as the construction of physical monuments, and that the institutions that maintain the written tradition should be supported with the same level of investment and the same degree of commitment that the institutions that maintain the physical infrastructure receive. The continuing study of the pyramid texts The ongoing effort to understand the meaning of individual utterances, to reconstruct the ritual context in which the utterances were originally performed, and to trace the evolution of the textual tradition from the pyramid texts through the coffin texts to the Book of the Dead, is one of the most active and most productive areas of contemporary Egyptological research. The research is producing new insights, new understandings of individual texts, new interpretations of the ritual program, and new perspectives on the relationship between the texts and the architectural, artistic, and social contexts in which they were produced. The Pyramid of Unas stands at Saqqara. It is small, it is eroded, it is not impressive from the outside. But inside the burial chamber that was carved into the bedrock beneath the modest superstructure, there are words. Words that have been waiting for more than 4,300 years. Words that were carved into the limestone and filled with blue-green pigment by scribes who believed that the power of language could ensure the pharaoh's survival in the afterlife. Words that have outlasted the pyramid that houses them, the dynasty that produced them, the civilization that created them, and the religion that gave them meaning. The words are the pyramid texts, the oldest substantial body of religious literature in the world, the foundation of a textual tradition that would extend for more than 2,000 years. And that would produce the coffin texts, the Book of the Dead, and the entire written legacy of Egyptian funerary religion. The words were the pharaoh's insurance, his guarantee that the spells would be spoken, that the rituals would be performed, that the declarations of his divine status would be made, even if the priests who were supposed to perform the rituals ceased to come, even if the cult that was supposed to maintain the offerings was disbanded, even if the institution that was supposed to ensure his eternal survival was forgotten. The words were the backup, the permanent, carved in stone, pigment-filled backup that would survive when everything else had failed. And the words have survived. The priests have ceased to come. The cult has been disbanded. The institution has been forgotten. The pyramid has crumbled. The body has been lost. Everything that the Egyptian funerary tradition was designed to maintain has failed. Everything except the words. The words are still there, still legible, still readable, still carrying the message that they were designed to carry more than 4,300 years ago. The Pyramid of Unas is a small building with a large idea, the idea that words can outlast stone, that meaning can outlast mass, that the power of language can survive the collapse of the civilization that produced it and the destruction of the physical context in which it was originally placed. The idea was tested at Saqqara more than 4,300 years ago, tested by a pharaoh who inscribed the oldest religious texts in human history on the walls of his burial chamber, and who bet against the precedent of 3 centuries of architectural tradition that the text would protect his soul more effectively than the stones that protected his body. The bet was won. The texts have survived. The pyramid has crumbled, its casing stripped, its core eroded, its exterior reduced to a low mound that is barely recognizable as a royal monument. But the texts are still there, still legible, still readable, still carrying the message that they were designed to carry. The texts have been copied into the pyramids of subsequent pharaohs, onto the coffins of Middle Kingdom officials, onto the papyrus scrolls of New Kingdom tombs. The texts have been translated into French, into English, into German, into every major language of the modern world. The texts have been studied by scholars in every country and every generation since Maspero first entered the burial chamber in 1881 and found the blue-green hieroglyphs on the walls. The chain that begins in the Pyramid of Unas extends across more than 2,000 years of Egyptian history and across the entire range of Egyptian social classes. From the pharaoh to the commoner, from the gold-covered burial chamber to the simple wooden coffin, from the pyramid to the papyrus scroll, the chain is unbroken. Each link connects to the next through a process of copying, adapting, and extending that preserved the core texts while adding new material that reflected the changing beliefs and the changing circumstances of each successive period. The chain is one of the longest chains of textual transmission in human history, and its first link is the Pyramid of Unas, the small, eroded, modest pyramid at Saqqara, whose walls contain the oldest religious texts in the world. The first link is also the most important, because without the first link, there is no chain. Without the decision to inscribe the pyramid texts on the walls of the Pyramid of Unas, the oral tradition would have remained oral, vulnerable to the interruptions, the distortions, and the losses that affect all oral traditions over time. The inscription made the tradition permanent. It fixed the texts in stone, it preserved them against the vicissitudes of oral transmission, and it ensured that the religious literature of the Old Kingdom would be available to every subsequent generation of scribes, priests, and scholars who chose to read it, to copy it, and to build upon it. The pharaoh Unas is not famous. His name is not recognized by most people who have heard of Tutankhamun, of Ramesses, of Cleopatra. His pyramid is not visited by the millions of tourists who flock to Giza to see the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx. His reign is not commemorated by any event or any achievement that the popular imagination has preserved. But his contribution to human civilization is as great as that of any pharaoh who ever ruled Egypt, because his decision to inscribe the pyramid texts on the walls of his burial chamber was the decision that preserved the oldest religious literature in human history, that established the textual tradition that would sustain Egyptian funerary religion for the next 2 millennia, and that demonstrated, for the first time in the history of human civilization, that words can be more enduring than stone. The Pyramid of Unas stands at Saqqara, small, eroded, modest in every physical dimension. It does not command the horizon. It does not dominate the landscape. It does not attract the crowds that gather at Giza. It is a building that must be entered to be appreciated, a structure whose significance lies not in its exterior form, but in its interior content, not in the mass of its stone, but in the meaning of its words. The words are the oldest religious texts in human history. They have been waiting on the walls of the burial chamber for more than 4,300 years. Waiting to be read, waiting to be understood, waiting to deliver the message that they were designed to deliver. The message is about death and about the hope of overcoming death. The message is about the power of language to create reality, to transform the nature of things, and to ensure the survival of the soul beyond the limits of the body and beyond the collapse of the civilization that produced it. The message is about permanence, about the kind of permanence that stone cannot provide and that only words can achieve. The Pyramid of Unas is not the largest pyramid. It is not the most famous pyramid. It is not the most impressive pyramid by any physical measure, but it is the most important pyramid because it contains the most important idea in the history of Egyptian civilization. The idea that words can protect the soul. The idea that inscribed text can ensure the survival of the spirit beyond the death of the body. The idea that the power of language can achieve what the power of stone alone cannot. The preservation of meaning, of identity, and of the specific, articulated, theologically precise religious beliefs that define the pharaoh's relationship to the gods and that ensure his transformation from mortal to immortal. The pharaoh Unas bet on words. He bet against the precedent of 3 centuries of architectural tradition. He bet against the assumption that bigger pyramids provide better protection. He bet on meaning over mass, on language over limestone, on the enduring power of the written word over the temporary power of the built structure. The bet was placed more than 4,300 years ago. The pyramid has crumbled. The texts have survived. The bet was won. The stone crumbles. The words endure. And the endurance of the words, across 4,300 years, across the collapse of civilizations and the extinction of religions, and the transformation of languages and the revolution of human understanding, is the Pyramid of Unas's gift to the world, a gift that is still being received, a gift that is still being read, a gift that will continue to be read for as long as human beings care about what their ancestors believed, what they hoped, and what they inscribed on the walls of their tombs in the desperate, magnificent, ultimately successful attempt to make their words outlast their world. The Great Pyramid is the larger structure. The Pyramid of Unas is the larger idea. And the idea that words can outlast stone, that meaning can outlast mass, that the power of language can survive the collapse of the civilization that produced it, is the idea that the Pyramid of Unas has been demonstrating for more than 4 millennia, quietly, patiently, and with a persistence that no physical structure can match. The stone crumbles, the words endure,